Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep, and I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. It was late October, that time of year when the air turns crisp, the nights stretch longer, and the roads become eerily empty after dark. I was driving back home from a weekend trip with my friend, Eric. We had spent the last 2 days hiking through the mountains, away from all the noise of the city, just enjoying the solitude of nature. The trip had been exhausting, but in the best way possible. My legs ached from the long hikes, and all I could think about was getting home, taking a hot shower, and collapsing into bed. Eric was in the passenger seat, fiddling with his phone, probably trying to get a signal. We had been driving for hours, and at this point, we were in the middle of nowhere. Miles of trees stretching on both sides of the road. No streetlights, no other cars, just the two of us on an empty highway. I glanced at the dashboard clock. 1:42 a.m. A part of me wanted to pull over and rest for a bit, but we were so close to home. Maybe another hour or so, and we'd be out of this deserted stretch. Besides, stopping on an abandoned road in the middle of the night didn't seem like a great idea. Eric let out an annoyed sigh. "Still no service," he muttered, shoving his phone into his hoodie pocket. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands firm on the wheel. "It's been dead for the past 30 miles. Don't think it's coming back anytime soon." He groaned and leaned his head against the window. "Remind me why we took this route again?" I chuckled. "Because you said you wanted to get home fast, and this is a shortcut." "Right," he mumbled, sounding half asleep. The road was unusually quiet. I mean, really quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant howls from coyotes. Just the steady hum of my car's engine and the occasional crunch of gravel when my tires hit the shoulder. It was strange, but I didn't say anything. I just focused on driving, the headlights cutting through the thick darkness. I had taken this route before, years ago, but only during the day. I remembered it being a little eerie even then, long stretches of nothingness, abandoned houses with boarded-up windows, the kind of place that made you feel like you shouldn't be there. But at night, it felt wrong. I pushed the thought away. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. We passed an old, rusted road sign, barely visible in the dim glow of my headlights. The letters were worn, but I could still make out the words. Blackridge Road. Something about that name sent a shiver down my spine. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was just the way it looked, all bent and decayed, like no one had bothered to replace it in decades. Eric shifted in his seat, rubbing his arms like he was suddenly cold. "Hey, does it feel weird to you?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated. "I dunno, just off, like we're the only ones out here." I nodded, my grip tightening on the wheel. "Yeah, not a single car in either direction for miles." We drove on in silence for a while. The longer we stayed on this road, the heavier the air felt, like something unseen was pressing down on us. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something standing on the side of the road, just past the tree line. I barely had time to register it before we sped past, but my gut twisted. It had been a person, or at least, it looked like one. A tall figure, standing perfectly still, just beyond the reach of the headlights. My heart started pounding, but I didn't say anything. Maybe it was just a hitchhiker, or a hunter, or someone who lived in one of those rundown houses we had passed earlier. But why the hell were they just standing there? Eric must have seen it too, because a second later, he turned to me. "Did you see?" "Yeah." Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Eric laughed, but it was forced. Probably just some weird guy. People are strange, man. I nodded, but I kept my foot steady on the gas. Something about it didn't sit right with me. The road stretched on, endless and unchanging, swallowed by the night. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to check the rearview mirror. Something in my gut told me that if I did, I wouldn't like what I saw. The silence inside the car was thick. Neither of us spoke about what we had just seen, but it lingered in the air, unshakable. I kept my hands on the wheel, my knuckles tense, while Eric shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Every so often, I would glance at the side mirrors, half expecting to see that figure standing in the distance, watching us. But there was nothing, just the endless stretch of Blackridge Road, disappearing into the darkness behind us. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, just some person out late, maybe heading home, maybe lost. But something about the way they stood there, motionless, half hidden beyond the tree line, didn't sit right. Eric finally broke the silence. That was weird, right? His voice was low, like he didn't want to say it too loud. I nodded. Yeah. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. Like, really weird. Who the hell just stands out there in the middle of nowhere? I didn't answer. I didn't have an answer. For a few minutes, we drove on, the only sound coming from the tires rolling over the cracked pavement. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind kept going back to that shadowy figure. Something about it bothered me in a way I couldn't explain. Then, just as my grip on the situation started to loosen, I saw it again. At first, it was just a flicker, a shape at the edge of my vision, something dark against the trees. But as the car pushed forward, the figure became clearer. Standing just off the road, maybe 10 feet from the shoulder, was the same person. Same height. Same stillness. No movement. No expression. Just standing. My stomach twisted. My hands gripped the wheel so hard my fingers ached. Eric tensed beside me. Dude. I swallowed. I know. This wasn't possible. We had been driving at least 10 minutes since we saw them the first time. There were no cars, no intersections, no paths leading through the trees. There was no way anyone could have gotten ahead of us unless they had been running full speed through the dark woods. And even then, how? Eric let out a nervous laugh, but there was no humor in it. Okay, that's messed up. I didn't say anything. I just kept driving. The figure faded behind us again, swallowed by the darkness. This time, I checked the rearview mirror, and my blood ran cold. For a brief second, as the taillights flickered against the road behind us, I saw something. The figure, standing in the middle of the road, not at the edge, not by the trees, directly behind us, perfectly still. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart started hammering. I blinked hard, and when I looked again, the road was empty. It was gone. My pulse was so loud in my ears that I almost didn't hear Eric when he spoke. You okay, man? I forced a nod. Yeah, just tired. I wasn't about to tell him what I had just seen. I didn't want to say it out loud, didn't want to make it real. I pressed harder on the gas. I didn't care about the speed limit anymore. I just wanted off this road. For a while, nothing happened. Just the same quiet, empty road stretching on. But my body was tense, waiting, expecting something. Then, maybe 5 miles later, we saw the house. It came out of nowhere. 1 second, it was just trees, endless and unchanging. The next, there was a clearing, and in the middle of it sat an old, abandoned house. At least, it should have been abandoned. The windows were shattered, the wooden siding peeling away, the roof caved in at one side. It looked like it had been left to rot decades ago. But what sent a chill down my spine was the light. A single light, faint, barely visible, coming from somewhere inside. Eric straightened in his seat. Do you see that? Yeah. He turned his head, watching as we passed. What the hell is a light doing on in there? I had no idea. There was no reason for that house to have power. It was falling apart, completely overgrown with vines and surrounded by nothing but dead trees. And yet, for a brief moment, I thought I saw movement behind one of the broken windows. A shape! Watching us. I swallowed hard and faced forward again. Just keep driving. Eric didn't argue. Neither of us wanted to stop. We passed the house, and the road stretched on in front of us, the trees closing in once more. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine, but something was wrong. The air inside the car suddenly felt heavier. The headlights seemed dimmer, struggling against the darkness. And then I heard it. A thump. Soft at first, almost like something brushing against the trunk of the car. Then another, louder. Eric sat up. What was that? I didn't answer. Thump. This time, it was on the roof. A chill ran down my spine. My hands clenched the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. Eric twisted in his seat, looking behind us. Dude, I think. Bang! Something slammed against the roof. Not a branch. Not debris. Something heavy. I felt the vibration through the entire car. My foot slammed on the gas. Eric was panicking now, twisting around in his seat, trying to see. What the hell is on the car, man? I didn't answer. I didn't look. I just drove. The road ahead felt like it was stretching, like it was longer than it should have been, like we were driving in place, trapped. The thumping continued. Faster now, like footsteps. Something was on the roof, moving. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Dead silence. My breathing was ragged. My hands were shaking. Eric was still turned around, his face pale, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He slowly turned back to me. I think it's gone. I exhaled shakily, but I didn't slow down. I wasn't taking any chances. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the engine as I pushed the car forward, desperate to get off this cursed road. But then, just as I started to think we were okay, Eric gasped. His eyes were wide, staring at something in the side mirror. His lips parted, but no sound came out. I didn't want to look. I really didn't. But something in me forced my eyes to the rearview mirror. And I saw it. Standing in the middle of the road, far behind us, but still visible in the dim red glow of the taillights. The figure. Closer than before. Watching. Waiting. And this time, it was smiling. The image of that smiling figure, standing in the middle of the road, burned itself into my brain like a brand. We were moving fast, too fast for any normal person to have caught up to us. Yet, there it was, as if it had always been there, waiting, and we were just looping back to it. That wasn't possible. I stared at the road ahead, forcing myself to breathe, to think. But my thoughts were scattered, my chest tight. Eric, on the other hand, was done keeping quiet. What the hell is going on? His voice was higher than normal, his breathing uneven. Dude, this doesn't make sense. I kept my hands firm on the wheel. I don't know. You saw that, right? It wasn't just me? I nodded once, short and stiff. Eric let out a shaky laugh, but it wasn't amusement, it was panic. Okay. This is messed up. I mean, like, really messed up. The road stretched endlessly ahead of us, winding deeper into the darkness. I glanced at the GPS again. The screen flickered. Then, it reset. Just a loading icon. No map. No directions. Nothing. What the? I tapped at it, but the touchscreen was unresponsive. I grabbed my phone from the console, but the screen showed no signal. Eric tried his own. Same thing. No bars, no internet. We weren't that far from town. There was no reason for both of our phones to cut out at the same time. Great, Eric muttered. He was fidgeting, his knee bouncing. Just perfect. The car's headlights felt weaker now, struggling against the darkness. The trees lining the road seemed closer somehow, pressing in from both sides. The road itself was eerily quiet. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just the low hum of the engine. Then, the radio turned on by itself. A burst of static filled the car. Eric jumped. Dude, what the hell? I didn't touch anything. The volume dial turned on its own, rising. The static crackled louder. Beneath the noise, something else was there. A voice. It was faint, distorted, like a whisper behind the static. I strained to make it out. "Leave!" A chill ran down my spine. Then the static cut off. "Silence!" I stared at the radio. My hand moved toward the dial, hesitating, before I finally switched it off completely. The air inside the car was suffocating now. Eric ran a hand over his face. "This isn't funny anymore." "I know," I said quietly. We needed to get out of here. Fast. But the road just kept stretching on, like we weren't actually moving forward. The thump returned. It came from above us. Eric tensed. No, 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 no. Another thump. Louder. Something was on the roof. I didn't slow down, didn't look up. I just drove. Eric's breathing was ragged. His hand hovered near the window like he wanted to roll it down, but he didn't. Then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow moved past my side window. I barely had time to register it before there was a loud bang. The entire car shook, like something huge had dropped onto it. Eric screamed. I slammed on the gas, the tires screeching against the pavement. The weight on the roof shifted. A scraping sound ran along the metal, like nails dragging over it. Then, a hand slapped against the windshield. I barely had time to process it before it was gone. Eric was hyperventilating. His face was pale, his eyes wide. What the hell was that? I didn't answer. I couldn't. We drove in silence for what felt like forever. Then, through the windshield, I saw the house again. The same abandoned house we had passed earlier. Oh! No, that wasn't possible. I hit the brakes, bringing the car to a jerky stop. Eric sat frozen, his breath coming in uneven gasps. How are we back here? I didn't answer. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone again. Still no signal. The house sat there, silent. But something was different. The front door, which had been slightly ajar before, was now wide open. The dim, flickering light inside was still there. Something was inside. Eric grabbed my arm. Dude, just turn around. Find another way. I wanted to. I really did. But there was only one road. We had been driving in a straight line, and somehow we were right back where we started. I forced myself to breathe. Think. There has to be a turn we missed, I said, though I didn't believe it. Eric nodded quickly, desperate. Yeah, let's just go back. Find a gas station or something. I put the car in reverse. The road behind us was pitch black. I turned the wheel, trying to angle the car around. That's when the headlights flickered. Then they cut out completely. Darkness swallowed us. Eric's breath hitched. No. I twisted the key. The engine sputtered. It wouldn't start. Come on, I muttered, twisting it again. Nothing. Eric was shaking now. This isn't happening. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam was weak, barely cutting through the blackness outside. Then, something moved at the tree line. I saw it in the dim glow of my phone's light. A figure, standing there, still, watching. And then more appeared, one by one, emerging from the shadows between the trees. Not running, not approaching, just standing, silent, waiting. I felt my stomach drop. We need to get inside the house. The words came out before I could stop them. Eric turned to me sharply. What? They're out there, I whispered. The car won't start. Eric looked out the window. His face drained of color as he saw what I saw. No, he whispered. The figures weren't moving closer, but they weren't leaving. One of them stepped slightly forward. The weak glow of my phone finally caught its face. I wished I hadn't looked. It was the same one, the same figure from before. and it was still smiling. A horrible, unnatural grin that stretched too wide, too long. I felt a sharp chill crawl down my spine, my hands turning ice cold. Eric's breathing was ragged. Okay, okay. House. We go to the house. I nodded, my throat dry. Without another word, we bolted. The moment we stepped out of the car, the figures started moving. Fast. Too fast. We ran. The house loomed ahead, the open door like a gaping mouth. I didn't care what was inside anymore, because whatever was out here was worse. We ran toward the house like our lives depended on it, because at that moment, they did. I could hear footsteps behind us. Fast, heavy, unnatural. They weren't just running, they were gaining. Eric was ahead of me, arms pumping as he sprinted toward the door. I was right behind him, my breath coming in short, painful gasps. The figures were closing in. That smiling one was the closest. I didn't dare turn my head fully, but I saw it in the corner of my vision. Long limbs, 2 long arms, and that terrible, stretching grin. It wasn't just smiling. It was enjoying this. I reached the steps first, practically throwing myself inside. Eric followed, stumbling as he slammed the door behind him. The second it shut, the world outside went silent. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, just the sound of our ragged breathing. Eric locked the door. Not that I thought a simple lock could do anything against what we had just seen. The house was dark, except for that same flickering light from earlier. It came from down the hall, barely illuminating the dusty wooden floors. I swallowed hard. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to think. Eric was pacing, hands on his head. Dude, what the hell? I couldn't answer, because I didn't know. I glanced at the front window. The glass was so dirty and fogged up that I couldn't see outside. A part of me didn't want to. We can't stay here, Eric said, his voice strained. I exhaled slowly. And go where? He opened his mouth, but no words came, because there was no answer. This road wasn't normal. This night wasn't normal. Eric wiped his face with both hands. This is a nightmare. This isn't. Then the floor creaked above us. We both froze. Another creak. Louder. Closer. Someone or something was upstairs. Eric backed up until he hit the wall. He was shaking. No, not doing this. My eyes stayed locked on the ceiling. Then, bang! A loud, deafening thud from directly above us. We both flinched. And then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving toward the staircase. Eric grabbed my arm. We need to get out of here. I was about to answer when the whispering started. Not from upstairs. Not from outside. From the walls. It was all around us. Soft, unintelligible murmurs. Eric turned in a frantic circle, his breathing erratic. Dude, what? Where is that coming from? I didn't answer, because I had just noticed something else. The flickering light down the hall, it wasn't just a light. It was a door, slightly open, and from the crack in the door frame, a shadow moved. Something was in there, watching, waiting, and then it stepped out. At first, it just looked like a man, tall, thin, but the more I stared, the more I realized it wasn't. Its proportions were off. Arms too long, fingers too bony, and its face was blurred, like my eyes couldn't focus on it properly. And then, it smiled, the same smile as the thing outside. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like concrete. Eric gasped. He grabbed my arm, yanking me backward. We need to go. But the thing moved. Fast. Too fast. 1 second it was by the door. The next it was right in front of us. Eric screamed. I didn't even think. I just ran. I grabbed Eric and bolted for the stairs. The house felt like it was shifting, closing in, stretching. The walls seemed taller, the ceiling higher. My footsteps felt wrong. I didn't even realize I was going up until we hit the second floor. The whispers followed us. They grew louder. Eric was pulling at me. Why are we going up? We need to get out. I didn't know. It just felt like something was pushing us. Like we had to go up. Like something wanted us here. And then I saw it. At the end of the long, dark hallway, there was a single door. Unlike the rest of the house, it was pristine. No dust, no cracks. And it was glowing. A faint, unnatural glow seeped through the cracks beneath it. The whispers were coming from inside, and they were saying our names. I stopped dead. Eric crashed into me. Dude, don't stop, don't stop. But I was staring at the door, because I knew. I didn't know how, but I knew. That door was the way out. Or it was something much, much worse. The footsteps behind us returned. Closer. Faster. I reached for the handle. Eric grabbed my wrist. What are you doing? Don't. The door swung open on its own. And beyond it was not another room. It was the road. The same abandoned road. But it wasn't outside. It was wrong. The sky was red. The trees were twisted. And in the middle of it all, the figures were waiting. Every single one of them. Smiling. Reaching. Eric was shaking his head, pulling me back. No, this isn't real. This isn't. Then, from behind us, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I turned just in time to see it. The thing from downstairs. Its face was no longer blurred. And it was mine. The exact same face. Grinning. And then, it pulled me through the door. The moment I was pulled through the door, the world around me shifted. It felt like falling, but not down. More like I was being ripped sideways. For a second, I couldn't see, couldn't hear. Then, I hit the ground. Hard. The air was knocked from my lungs, my vision blurry. I scrambled to push myself up, heart pounding. And that's when I saw it. I was back on the road. But it wasn't the same road. The sky was a sickening shade of red. The trees along the roadside were twisted and gnarled, their branches stretched like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath me felt wrong, too smooth, too unnatural. And the worst part? The figures were all standing there, waiting, watching, their heads tilted at an unnatural angle, their mouths stretched into those horrible, impossible smiles. I stumbled back, my hands shaking. Where was Eric? I spun around, searching, but he wasn't there. Eric! My voice echoed, but it sounded distorted, like the road itself was swallowing the sound. Then, a whisper. From behind me. I turned too fast, my vision swimming, and standing just a few feet away was me, or something that looked like me. Same clothes, same face, same height. But the smile was all wrong. It was too wide, too unnatural. Its eyes were hollow. And then it spoke. But it wasn't just my voice. It was layered, like 100 voices speaking at once. You never left. I staggered back. What? The figures behind it started moving, slowly, deliberately. Each step they took made the air around me feel heavier, like I was sinking, like I was being swallowed whole. I turned and ran. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just ran. The road stretched out endlessly. The further I went, the less sense it made. The trees shifted when I wasn't looking. The sky pulsed, almost like it was breathing. And then, footsteps, right behind me. I pushed myself harder, lungs burning. My mind was screaming. My body felt like it was tearing apart. Then, a voice. Not from the figures. Not from whatever was chasing me. from ahead. Dude! Eric! I looked up. He was standing in the middle of the road. But something was wrong. There were two of him. One was waving me toward him, his face twisted in panic. The other was standing still, silent, watching. The second Eric's face was too calm, too still, and he was smiling. I skidded to a stop, my breath ragged. The figures were still coming. The other me was still watching. I had seconds to decide. Eric, the one who wasn't smiling, yelled, "Come on." The other one just tilted his head, waiting. I made my choice. I ran toward the one who looked afraid. The second I got close, he grabbed my arm. And then, the road disappeared. The sky turned black. The ground beneath me vanished. I felt weightless, falling, twisting, breaking. And then, I woke up. I gasped for air. My heart was slamming in my chest. I was lying on my back, staring up at a normal sky. The stars were out. The road looked normal again. The trees weren't twisted. The air wasn't heavy. Eric was next to me, on his hands and knees, shaking. I sat up fast. What happened? He looked at me, his eyes wide. I don't know. 1 second, we were in that place, and then he stopped, his breathing uneven. Dude, we need to get out of here. Now. I didn't argue. We pulled ourselves up and started running. We didn't look back. Not until we saw the car. It was still there, sitting on the side of the road, the headlights dim. The door was open. I stopped. Wait, did we leave it like that? Eric hesitated. I don't remember. A cold dread settled in my stomach. Something was wrong. And then, from inside the car, we heard a noise. A soft exhale, like someone was sitting in the driver's seat, breathing. We stood there, frozen, staring at the car. The night was still, too still. That breathing, soft, steady, coming from inside. It wasn't ours. Eric whispered, "We're not alone." My throat was dry. My whole body screamed for me to run. But we needed the car. There was no way we were walking back after everything we had just been through. Eric took a slow step forward. Dude, we left the car empty. Right? I swallowed hard. Yeah, we did. We inched closer. The headlights were still dimly flickering, the door wide open. Then, the breathing stopped. My chest tightened. I reached out, my hand shaking, and grabbed the edge of the door. Slowly, I leaned forward, just enough to see inside. And what I saw shouldn't have been possible. The driver's seat was empty. No one was there. But there were marks on the seat. Indents. Like someone had been sitting there just moments before. Eric's breath hitched. Let's just go. Now. I didn't argue. We jumped in, slammed the doors shut, and Eric turned the key so fast I thought it would snap. The engine roared to life. The headlights flared, and for one single second, as the beams lit up the road ahead, we saw them, the figures, lined up along the road, still, silent, smiling, waiting. Eric punched the gas. The tires screeched as we tore away from that place. Trees blurred past. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst. We didn't talk, didn't look back. We just drove. It took an hour before we saw the first road sign. Another 30 minutes before we finally reached town. When we pulled into Eric's driveway, we sat there for a long time, the engine still running. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. I finally broke the silence. What happened back there? Eric shook his head, gripping the wheel. I don't know. I don't want to know. I turned to look at him. He was staring ahead, his knuckles white. His hands were shaking. He exhaled sharply. We don't talk about this. Ever. I wanted to argue, to say we had to figure it out, that we couldn't just pretend it didn't happen. But deep down, I knew he was right. Some things weren't meant to be understood. Some places weren't meant to be visited. We got out of the car, still silent. I didn't even bother grabbing my stuff from the back seat. I just wanted to be inside, somewhere safe, if that even existed anymore. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on that road. The twisted trees, the blood-red sky, the figures standing in the darkness. And worse, the other me, that smiling version of myself, still waiting, still watching. And then, at some point, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, a sound outside my window. Soft, steady, breathing. I sat up fast. My chest tightened. I held my breath and listened. Nothing, just silence. But I didn't move, didn't sleep. I just sat there, staring at the window, waiting for something, anything, to happen. It didn't. Not that night. Not the next. Not for weeks. But here's the thing. Even now, after all this time, every once in a while, when I'm alone, when the night is too quiet, when everything feels just a little too still, I hear it. Soft, steady, a breath, close, right behind me, waiting. I never should have stopped on that road. It was the summer of 2009 when I first found myself working at the old St. Helens Hospital, located in the heart of a quiet, isolated town. I had just graduated from nursing school, and this job was a golden opportunity for someone like me, young, eager, and ready to make a difference in the world. The hospital itself was a towering, grimy building that had been around for decades, its dark brick walls standing as a silent testament to the history it held within. I was assigned to work the night shift, which didn't bother me at first. There was something about the quiet of the night that appealed to me. The late hours allowed me to spend more time with the patients who seemed to need the most attention. My colleagues and I would spend hours talking quietly in the break room, sharing stories about our lives, our work, and the odd happenings that seemed to come with working in a hospital. Nothing too alarming, just strange occurrences, footsteps when no one was around, lights flickering for no reason, doors that would shut on their own. But it wasn't anything to lose sleep over, or so I thought. The staff was a mix of people from all walks of life. There was the head nurse, a woman in her late 50s, who had worked in hospitals for as long as anyone could remember. She was stern but kind, a real stickler for rules. There was also Tom, an orderly who'd been with St. Helens for years, always telling us ghost stories about the place as if it were just part of the job. Then, of course, there were the doctors, Dr. Harlan and Dr. Matthews, both experienced, highly professional, but often too absorbed in their work to notice the oddities that seemed to follow the building around. We had a routine: arrive, check on the patients, administer medications, monitor vitals, and do our rounds. But there were nights when things didn't go as planned. It wasn't anything noticeable at first, just a creeping sense that something wasn't quite right. The nurses on the night shift, including myself, would walk the long halls, hearing odd sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. Maybe it was just the old pipes or the wind whistling through cracks in the windows, but there was always this nagging feeling that we weren't alone in the hospital, even when we should have been. One of the things I remember most vividly was the constant feeling of being watched. It was especially pronounced in the east wing of the building. This part of the hospital had been around the longest and was filled with rooms that had yet to be updated. It was as if time had forgotten this section. The walls were faded yellow, and the linoleum floors looked like they hadn't been replaced in decades. The air was heavier there, like something had settled in, unwilling to leave. Even the patients who stayed there had this distant, eerie look in their eyes, as if they were waiting for something or someone. I would often find myself in these empty halls alone, walking between rooms, doing my job, but always feeling like something was just beyond my reach. There was no sound, no movement, yet the weight of the silence was deafening. That was the start of it. The first hint that something was off. Despite the strange occurrences, I had no real reason to believe anything supernatural was at play. After all, this was a hospital, a place of healing, of science, of life. But there were moments, brief as they were, when the hair on the back of my neck would stand up and it'd feel the air grow cold, even in the middle of summer. At first, I thought it was just fatigue or nerves. But the longer I worked there, the more it became clear that there was something much darker hidden within those walls. The patients were quiet, for the most part. The elderly man in room 207, who always sat by the window, staring out at the empty parking lot below. The young woman in room 305, who had been in a coma for months, but seemed to react to things that no one could see. And the old nurse who had worked there for decades, but no one could remember her name. Each of them seemed to carry their own stories, some filled with pain, others with sorrow. But it was the stories that weren't being told, the things that were unsaid, that began to weigh on me the most. One night, as I made my rounds, I found myself in the east wing again. I had been called to check on one of the long-term residents, a man in his late 60s who had been bedridden for years. His room was at the very end of the hall, the farthest point from the nurse's station. It was always quiet there, but tonight was different. The air felt thicker, heavier. I could feel my breath catch in my chest as I walked down the hall toward his room. It was then that I first noticed something strange. A faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from the room at the farthest corner. It wasn't the sound of a patient or a nurse, or even the usual noises of the building. It was something else. A soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being moved across the floor. I paused, my hand frozen on the doorframe of the room. Inside, the patient was sleeping, his breathing steady. There was no one else around. But the sound continued, slow and steady, from somewhere deeper within the room. I tried to shake it off as my imagination, but something inside me couldn't let it go. As I turned to leave, the light above me flickered. Then the temperature dropped, and I could see my breath in the air. My heart began to race as I hurried back to the nurse's station. The events of that night stayed with me for days, and as I began to talk to my coworkers about it, I realized that I wasn't the only one who had experienced something strange. But no one dared speak up too loudly. Not here, not in a place like this. Something was wrong at St. Helens, but it was only the beginning. The longer I stayed, the more I would learn. And the more I would wish I had never stepped foot inside that haunted hospital. The first unsettling incident took place on a quiet Tuesday night, the kind of evening that starts with a whisper of normalcy, only to spiral into something that would haunt me for the rest of my time at St. Helens. I had finished my usual rounds, checking on the patients in the West Wing, and then moving through the middle section of the hospital. Everything had seemed routine, patients resting, the staff chatting quietly, and the hum of the hospital's old machinery filling the silence. As the night stretched on, I was assigned to check on the East Wing again. For some reason, it always felt colder in that part of the hospital, even though the heat was cranked up throughout the building. It chalked it up to the old heating system or the building's age, but tonight, something felt different. There was an odd, almost imperceptible shift in the air, as if something were waiting to happen. I tried to dismiss it, but the feeling lingered as I walked down the long, narrow hallway. The first sign came when I passed room 207. I had already checked on Mr. Bennett earlier in the night, an elderly man who was always sitting by the window, staring out at the dark, empty parking lot. He never said much. It was as if he was waiting for something, but no one ever asked what. As I walked past his door, I glanced in, just to check if he was still sitting by the window. To my surprise, the curtain was drawn shut. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he had gotten up or decided to sleep earlier than usual. It wasn't out of character for him. But as I continued walking, I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone standing in the hallway behind me, but there was no one. The corridor was empty, dimly lit by the flickering overhead lights. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I brushed it off, reminding myself that it was late, and fatigue often made the mind play tricks. I was halfway down the hall when I heard something faint, a sound that didn't quite belong. It was a soft, dragging noise, like the sound of something heavy being moved across the floor. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. It wasn't the typical noise of a hospital at night. The building was usually quiet, but this sound was different. It was too deliberate, too slow. I glanced around, trying to locate the source. At first, I thought it might be coming from Mr. Bennett's room, but when I looked again, the door to room 207 was still shut tight. The noise stopped abruptly, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the building settling. Hospitals were full of strange sounds. Maybe it was just a pipe or the wind outside, but something about it didn't feel right. I continued my rounds, but the unsettling sensation clung to me like a shadow. I checked on the other patients, each one of them quiet, almost too quiet. Everything seemed still, unnervingly still, and the air was thick with that same heaviness I had noticed earlier. I had been in hospitals long enough to know that silence could be both comforting and eerie. But this felt different. It was as though the silence was waiting for something to break it. Around 2:30 a.m., I made my way back toward the nurse's station, and that's when I saw it. At the far end of the hall, just beyond the junction that led to the East Wing's main area, a door that had always been firmly shut was now ajar. The old storage room. It was strange because I had just passed it moments before, and I was certain the door had been closed. I approached cautiously, feeling the weight of the silence around me. My footsteps echoed in the empty hall as I reached the door. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. Inside, the room was dark, save for the dim light coming from the hallway. The storage room was small and filled with medical supplies, bandages, syringes, extra linens, and various equipment that wasn't in use. But there was something off about the way the items were arranged. The boxes and supplies seemed slightly out of place, as if someone had been rummaging through them and then hastily shoved everything back. I stepped further into the room, glancing around to make sure nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But as I turned to leave, my eyes caught something. A small black mark on the floor. It was just a speck at first, but as I knelt down to examine it, I realized it was a footprint, a single, muddy print that led from the back corner of the room all the way to the door. I froze. The mark was fresh, and there was no reason for anyone to have left it there. The storage room wasn't a place people typically went, and I knew no one had been in there for hours. The hairs on my neck stood on end as I backed away slowly, my pulse quickening. It didn't make sense. There was no one in the building at that hour, at least no one supposed to be there. But that mark, it was undeniable. I made my way back to the nurse's station, trying to shake off the unease that had taken root in my chest. I didn't want to alarm the others, so I kept the experience to myself, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. But even as I tried to convince myself it was nothing, the strange incidents began to pile up. The feeling of being watched became more intense, the unexplained noises more frequent. The air in the East Wing seemed colder, and the silence grew heavier, more oppressive. The next morning, I mentioned the strange footprint to one of my colleagues. Kate, who had worked at St. Helens for years. She gave me a curious look before shrugging it off, telling me I had probably just missed it the night before. But there was something in her eyes, something that told me she knew more than she was letting on. I didn't press her for answers. Part of me was afraid of what she might say. That was when I started to hear the rumors, the whispered conversations between staff members about things they had seen or heard over the years. Footsteps in empty rooms, lights flickering when no one was around, and strange, unexplained sounds late at night. But the one thing they all had in common was the East Wing. That section of the hospital seemed to hold a certain weight. No one who worked there for long was willing to speak openly about it, but the tension in the air was palpable. Still, I dismissed it, telling myself it was just the stress of the job. But as the days wore on, I began to feel that same unease creeping into my every step. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows. By the time my shift ended, I was physically and mentally exhausted, but I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of dread as I stepped out of the hospital. The events of the night had left a lingering feeling of uncertainty in my mind. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. It had been a week since the unsettling events in the East Wing, but things had only grown stranger. What had started as a subtle unease, a single mysterious footprint, was now escalating into something that was becoming impossible to ignore. Each night, as I walked the same sterile halls, the sensation of something watching me became more palpable, more suffocating. The familiar creaks of the building that had once been just part of the routine were now amplified, as though the hospital itself was alive and aware of my every movement. The flickering lights became a nightly occurrence. It started with just one or two lights in the East Wing going out, but over time, it spread. Sometimes, entire sections of the building would fall into darkness, only to return to their normal state moments later, as if nothing had happened. At first, I thought it was just a power issue, old wiring, faulty bulbs, but when the lights would flicker in perfect synchronization, it felt deliberate. Like someone or something was controlling the darkness. The shadows cast by the dim light felt longer, darker, and more oppressive. By the third night, I could no longer dismiss the creeping suspicion that something was very wrong at St. Helens. The odd noises had started again, more frequent now. It was subtle at first, whispers at the edge of hearing, like voices in another room just out of reach. Sometimes I would hear footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, but when I would spin around, the hallway would be empty. The chilling part was that I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that someone or something was always a few steps behind me. The most disturbing part of it all was how the hospital staff seemed to avoid talking about it. Every time I would ask a colleague if they had noticed anything unusual, they would brush me off, change the subject, or offer nervous half-laughs. But I could see it in their eyes. They knew. They were scared too. One night, just as I was finishing my rounds, I found myself near room 207 again. Mr. Bennett had been gone for a few days, but there was something that drew me to his room. Maybe it was because it had been the site of my first strange encounter, or maybe it was because, in a way, I felt like I was being summoned there. I hesitated at the door, but curiosity won out, and I pushed it open. The room was empty, the bed stripped of its linens, the faint smell of antiseptic hanging in the air. But as I stepped inside, I noticed something on the floor. A small, dark stain near the window. It wasn't large, but it was unmistakably there. I knelt down to inspect it, and my heart skipped a beat. It looked like blood, but that wasn't the worst part. As I touched the stain with the tip of my finger, I heard it, a faint rustling sound behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was still. The window was closed, the curtains drawn tight. Nothing should have been moving. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but something felt off. The air in the room had thickened, pressing against me like an unseen force. I could almost hear it, breathing, just behind me, soft and uneven. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I bolted out of the room without looking back. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. The hospital was beginning to change. I couldn't explain it, but the walls themselves seemed to exhale, as though they were alive and breathing in time with my own quickening pulse. Over the next few nights, things continued to escalate. I found myself drawn to certain areas of the hospital without knowing why. The same hallways, the same rooms. I couldn't seem to stay away. Each time I walked those empty corridors, the sense of being followed intensified. And it wasn't just in the East Wing anymore. I began hearing footsteps in the West Wing too, long after the patients had settled for the night. But when I checked, the hallways were always empty. I began to keep track of the strange events in a notebook. The flickering lights, the whispers, the unexplained cold spots that seemed to appear without warning, the unsettling feeling of being watched. The patients in the East Wing had begun to complain about strange occurrences too. One night, Mrs. Davenport, a frail woman in her 70s, told me she had seen a figure standing at the foot of her bed. She couldn't describe it clearly, but she said it had been tall and shadowy, with glowing eyes that seemed to follow her every move. When I asked her if she was sure she hadn't been dreaming, she shook her head. It was real, she insisted. I could feel it. The tension among the staff was palpable. No one wanted to acknowledge what was happening, but we all felt it. There were rumors about the history of St. Helens, whispers about things that had happened long before any of us had come to work there. Nurses and doctors who had worked there for years spoke in hushed tones about the hospital's past, about its original construction, and the strange occurrences that had been part of it for decades. But no one ever elaborated. They just glanced over their shoulders and said it was best to forget. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening, something that was beyond reason, and I had to know what it was. That night, I decided to investigate. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a sense of desperation, I made my way back to the East Wing after hours. The hallways were eerily quiet, but that same heavy air, thick with unease, seemed to follow me. The building groaned and creaked as though it were waking from a deep slumber, its bones shifting with every step I took. I made my way to the storage room again. The door was slightly ajar, just like it had been that first night. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed it open, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. This time, I wasn't going to back down. I was going to find out what was going on, even if it killed me. The room was still, the faint scent of antiseptic hanging in the air. But something was different. As I stepped further in, I noticed something odd, a set of small, mud-streaked footprints on the floor. They led toward the back of the room, where the supply shelves were kept. My breath caught in my throat as I followed them, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, a figure stood in the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, its shape obscured by the darkness. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It was standing still, unmoving, just watching me. The air grew thick, and I could feel the temperature drop as I stared at it, my body frozen in terror. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough. I turned and ran, my heart hammering in my chest. But as I fled, I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, growing closer with every stride. The chase was on. The hospital had become something else, something I couldn't understand. Whatever it was that haunted St. Helens, it was alive, and it was beginning to make its presence known in ways I could no longer ignore. I didn't know who or what I was running from, but one thing was certain: I wasn't safe anymore. The hospital had become a place I no longer recognized. No matter how many times I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, or that it was just stress from the long shifts, deep down, I knew the truth. There was something in the building, something malevolent and ancient, and it was hunting me. That night, after the encounter in the storage room, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the figure watching me, its cold presence lingering just out of sight. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if trying to reach out and pull me back into the depths of whatever nightmare the hospital had become. I couldn't stay in my apartment any longer. I had to return to the building, to face it, whatever it was. I arrived at the hospital just before midnight. The sterile halls were empty, but the silence felt more oppressive than before. I could hear my footsteps echoing off the walls, each one more deafening than the last. The place felt like a tomb, as though every inch of it had been suffocated under the weight of secrets and shadows. I walked down the hallway to the east wing, where everything had started. The lights were dimmer than usual, flickering intermittently, as though the power itself was uncertain. The feeling of being followed had returned with a vengeance, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I didn't know what I was hoping to find, but I knew I had to find answers. As I reached room 207, I stopped dead in my tracks. The door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness peering through. The faintest sound drifted from the other side, low, guttural, almost like a growl. I couldn't move. I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound grew louder, more distinct, until I could almost make out words, though they were whispered too softly for me to comprehend. The growling mixed with a strange, rhythmic thumping, like someone, was knocking on the walls from within. I knew I had to go inside. It was the only way to confront whatever had been haunting me all this time. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open fully. The room was dark, the shadows seemingly alive, crawling across the walls like they had a mind of their own. The air was thick and stale, and the smell of decay seemed to permeate every corner of the room. My flashlight flickered, casting long, jagged shadows that made it impossible to focus on anything. And then I saw it. At the far corner of the room, where the bed had once stood, a figure crouched in the darkness. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs twisted in unnatural angles, as though it had been formed from the very darkness itself. Its eyes, glowing faintly red, were fixed on me, watching my every move with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. Its mouth was stretched wide in a grotesque smile, its teeth sharp and jagged, dripping with some dark, viscous substance. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I could only stare at it, frozen in place as the figure slowly rose to its full height. The thumping sound grew louder, and I realized with horror that it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from within the creature itself, as though its very heartbeat was reverberating through the room. It spoke, its voice low and raspy, like the sound of gravel scraping against metal. You should never have come back. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my body wouldn't obey me. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the creature, its gaze locking onto mine with a predatory hunger. It stepped forward, its movements jerky and disjointed, like a puppet on broken strings. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The creature's eyes never left me, its twisted grin widening as it drew closer. Why? Why are you doing this? I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. It let out a soft, eerie laugh, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. You think you're the first to try and uncover the truth? It hissed. This place. It's not just a hospital, it's a prison, and I've been waiting for you. I didn't understand. What was it talking about? What was it? Before I could process the words, the room began to shift. The walls seemed to pulse and bend, as though the very structure of the building was alive. The shadows grew longer, twisting and writhing, and the air grew colder, colder than it had ever been before. My breath came out in visible puffs as I watched in horror, unable to move. The creature took another step forward, its mouth opening wider, revealing rows upon rows of teeth, each one sharper than the last. Its voice was a guttural rasp now, like the sound of something ancient and evil, speaking from a place where time didn't exist. You should never have come back, but now you're mine. And then, just as I thought it would pounce, something strange happened. The creature paused, its head jerking to the side as though it had heard something. The room seemed to grow even darker, and a low, rumbling growl filled the air, coming from somewhere far off in the distance. The creature's eyes flicked toward the source of the sound, and for the first time, I saw fear in its gaze. The shadows around it began to retreat, and the air felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. But the creature wasn't backing down. No, it was preparing for something. Preparing for a fight. And then I heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing down the hallway outside the room. They were unmistakable, the sound of boots on linoleum, each step heavier than the last. The figure in the corner of the room snarled, its body tensing as it turned to face the door. I followed its gaze, my heart pounding in my chest. The door slammed open with a force that made the walls shake, and standing in the doorway was something I could never have imagined. It was a man, or rather, what had once been a man. His uniform was torn and tattered, and his skin was pale and covered in strange markings, as though it had been carved by some unseen force. His eyes were hollow, void of any emotion, but there was a strange power emanating from him, a power that made the creature in the corner falter. The two locked eyes, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, without a word, the man moved forward, his hands raised in a commanding gesture. The creature hissed in response, a sound that rattled my bones, but it didn't fight back. Instead, it retreated into the shadows, its form melting into the darkness like smoke dissipating in the wind. The man stood still, his eyes never leaving the spot where the creature had been. The air seemed to settle, the oppressive weight lifting, but the sense of danger remained. He turned toward me then, his eyes softening for the briefest moment before he spoke. "It's over," he said, his voice low and heavy. "For now." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and terror, trying to comprehend what had just happened. But the man only nodded, as though he understood everything without me saying a word. "You shouldn't have come back," he said softly. "But now that you have, you've seen too much. You can't leave." His words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and I realized, with a sinking heart, that I was no longer in control of my fate. Whatever had been unleashed in this place, whatever horrors had been waiting, they were far from over. The room was still. The only sound was my own labored breathing and the echo of my pounding heart. I could hardly believe what had just happened. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare and never look back. But something deep within me told me that it wasn't over, not yet. The man who had entered the room, the one who had stood between me and that monstrous creature, was still there, his presence imposing but oddly calming. He didn't speak, didn't make any move to reassure me, but there was a certain knowing in his eyes that told me he understood the fear and confusion swirling inside me. I didn't know who he was, where he came from, or why he was here. But one thing was clear, he wasn't just a bystander in this horror show. He was part of it, and somehow, he was the only thing standing between me and whatever had been lurking in this hospital for so long. The room felt colder than before, but the oppressive weight was beginning to lift, the feeling of being hunted starting to dissipate. Still, the aftermath of what I had witnessed left me shaken to my core. I wanted answers, and I needed them fast. I turned to the man, my voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "What? What is this place? What was that thing? And who are you?" He met my gaze for a moment, his face unreadable, before he finally spoke. "This hospital, it's been built on a foundation of darkness. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when it served a purpose, a noble one. But that changed a long time ago. The place became a magnet for things that shouldn't be. They've been feeding on the fear of the people who work here, the ones who come in search of healing but find only suffering." I swallowed hard, my stomach churning at his words. "But that thing, the creature, what is it?" "The creature," he said, "is just one of many. It's a manifestation of all the pain, all the suffering, and all the unspoken horror that's taken root in this building. It's not human. It's something older, something that predates everything you know. And it's not the worst of them. His words hung in the air like an unspeakable truth, a truth I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. The weight of it pressed down on me, suffocating me. I had thought that I had uncovered the source of the evil in this hospital, but now I was beginning to understand that the situation was far more complicated, more insidious than I could have imagined. I needed to leave. My body screamed for escape, for safety, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, and I couldn't seem to tear my eyes away from the man. He could sense my unease. "Leaving won't solve anything," he said, his voice calm but heavy with experience. "You've seen too much now. The hospital won't let you go. It never lets go." I recoiled, shaking my head. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" "The hospital," he said slowly, his gaze never leaving mine, "has a mind of its own. It doesn't want to be forgotten. It feeds on those who enter, pulling them deeper into its grasp, trapping them in a cycle they can't escape. The creature you saw, it's not just some random apparition. It's a guardian, a protector of the place. It will stop at nothing to keep its secrets hidden." "Then what? What am I supposed to do?" I asked, my voice trembling. "How do I get out of here?" He stared at me for a long moment, as if weighing my every word, before finally responding. "The only way out is to burn it all down. Destroy the hospital. It's the only way to sever the connection, to rid this place of its hold." I froze. "Burn it down?" He nodded gravely. "Yes, but it's not as simple as just setting a match to the building. The hospital will fight back. It will use everything it can to stop you." I felt a cold rush of dread flood through me. It sounded impossible. How could anyone destroy something like this? Something that had already shown its power so ruthlessly? "I can't do this alone," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to fight something like this." "You won't have to," the man replied. "There are others like me. People who have been here long enough to understand the true nature of this place. But they won't come for you until you make the first move." "Wait, you're saying there are more people like you?" "Yes," he said, his eyes darkening. "But they've been scattered. Some have tried to destroy the hospital before, but they were unsuccessful. The building has a way of protecting itself." I could feel the weight of his words settling over me, a deep sense of dread crawling into my bones. This wasn't just a bad situation. It was a war between forces I didn't understand, and now it seemed I had been thrust into the middle of it. The man turned away, his movements fluid and purposeful, as if he had already made up his mind about what needed to be done. "I can help you, but you have to trust me." "I don't know if I can trust anyone here," I muttered, the fear still gripping my chest. He turned back to me, his eyes locking with mine. "You don't have a choice. You've already seen what's here. You can't leave without facing it." I thought for a moment, weighing my options. I could try to leave, to run, but I knew deep down that it wouldn't work. The hospital wouldn't let me go. I had to fight. I had to end it, once and for all. "All right," I said, my voice barely audible. "I'll do it. But how do we even begin?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to the wall, pulling aside a loose panel of drywall. Behind it was a small, hidden compartment. He reached inside and pulled out a large, old-fashioned key. It was iron, rusted and worn, as though it had been buried for centuries. "This," he said, holding it up, "is the key to the basement. The heart of the hospital. If we're going to destroy it, we have to go to the source." I nodded, my heart racing in my chest. The basement. It was where everything had started, where the evil had first taken root. We made our way through the hospital, navigating the dark corridors, my pulse quickening with every step. The tension in the air was thick, as though the hospital itself was aware of our presence, watching, waiting. The walls seemed to close in on us as we approached the basement door. When we reached the door, the man inserted the key, and with a loud creak, it swung open. The stairs leading down into the basement were shrouded in darkness, the air heavy with the scent of mold and rot. I hesitated for a moment, my body screaming to turn back, but I knew I couldn't. Not now. We descended into the basement, and as we reached the bottom, I felt a shift in the air. It was colder here, and the darkness seemed more oppressive, more alive. And then I saw it. A massive, twisted form, a mass of shadows and writhing shapes, coiled in the center of the room. It was the heart of the hospital, the source of all the darkness. The creature's form was so vast, so incomprehensible, that it was almost impossible to look at. The man stepped forward, his voice steady. "This is where it all began, and this is where it will end." The hospital shook, the walls trembling as though the entire building was aware of what was happening. The creature in the center of the room began to stir, its form undulating like liquid darkness. It let out a screech, a deafening sound that reverberated through the basement. I felt my body shaking, the fear almost paralyzing me, but I knew this was it. The final battle. The man stepped forward, his arms raised, as he began chanting in a language I didn't understand. The air around us grew thicker, the darkness growing more oppressive. The hospital's final defense was being summoned, and I could feel the walls closing in. But this time, we weren't going to let it win. This time, we were going to take control. The man's voice grew louder, more powerful, until it seemed to resonate through the very bones of the building. The creature screamed again, but this time it was in pain. And then, with a final, triumphant shout, the man struck. The darkness screamed, thrashing violently, before it suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, almost unbearable. And just like that, it was over. The silence in the basement was suffocating, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. The oppressive darkness that had once consumed everything around me had dissipated, leaving behind only the faint echoes of its former presence. I stood there, breathless, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had just transpired. It was over. The hospital, the creature, the nightmare, it was all gone. But somehow, that didn't bring me the relief I thought it would. As the dust settled, the man who had led me through this ordeal stood quietly beside me. His face was no longer tense with the urgency of the battle. It was peaceful, even calm. He had done it. He had destroyed the source of the evil. But it wasn't just his victory. It was ours. I had stood by him, afraid but resolute, and together we had ended the terror that had plagued this place for far too long. I looked around the basement, taking in the desolation of the room. The creature that had once loomed so ominously in the center of the space was now gone, reduced to nothingness. The walls, once dark and oppressive, now seemed normal. The air felt lighter, as though the weight that had burdened this building for decades had finally been lifted. For a moment, I almost didn't know what to feel. There was no explosion, no dramatic final confrontation to signal the end. It had simply stopped. And with it, I realized how much I had changed. The fear that had consumed me when I first stepped into the hospital seemed distant now, like a memory from another life. The man turned to me, his eyes gentle but filled with the knowledge of what had transpired. "It's done," he said softly. "The hospital's grip on this place is broken. For now, at least. You've survived, and so have I. But there will always be others who come after us, drawn to places like this. But that's not your burden anymore." I nodded, absorbing his words. He was right. There would always be more hospitals, more dark places, more battles to fight. But in this moment, I had done something incredible. I had fought for my life, for my freedom, and for the truth. And I had emerged victorious. As we made our way back up the stairs, I felt a sense of finality. The building no longer seemed alive with malice, no longer held that oppressive, watchful quality that had kept me on edge for so long. It was almost normal, a place where people could once again come for healing without the fear that had gripped it for so long. Once we reached the main floor, I turned to the man. "Where do you go now?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. There was no way to go back to normal after what we had experienced. He wasn't going to simply vanish, nor would he return to the life he had known before this night. His eyes flickered with something, regret, perhaps, or maybe just the resignation that comes with a life like his. "I have other places to go," he said quietly. "Other hospitals, other nightmares. This is just one chapter. I'll keep going. There are always more." I swallowed, feeling the weight of his words. A part of me wanted to ask more, wanted to know his story, to understand the man behind the actions. But somehow, I knew that some questions were better left unasked. His path was his own, and mine was different. The truth was, I was ready to leave this place behind and never look back. "I'll be all right," I said, forcing a small smile. It was the truth, in a way. I had faced the unimaginable and survived. The nightmare was over, and I had a chance to rebuild. He nodded in understanding, as if sensing that the time for words had passed. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit, his silhouette fading into the shadows. I stood there for a moment, watching him go. Then I turned to the door that led outside. The morning light was just beginning to break through the hospital windows, casting a pale glow over everything. The night had passed, and with it, the darkness that had consumed this place. I stepped outside into the cool morning air, the fresh scent of the earth and trees filling my lungs. The world outside felt almost surreal in comparison to the horrors of the hospital. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing in the air, letting the normalcy wash over me. I didn't know what the future held, what kind of life I would have after all of this. Would I ever truly be free of the memories, the nightmares that haunted me now? Or would I carry them with me, buried deep inside, for the rest of my days? The truth was, I didn't have all the answers, but I didn't need to. What mattered was that I had survived. I had faced the darkness and walked away from it, and I was stronger for it. And maybe that's all that really mattered in the end. As I walked away from the hospital, I cast one last glance over my shoulder, my eyes lingering on the building that had held so much pain, so much fear. It was still there, standing silent in the light of dawn. But for me, it was nothing more than a memory. A chapter in a story that had finally come to an end. It was late September when I checked into the hotel, a time when the air carried a chill that signaled the change of seasons. The leaves had begun to brown at the edges, rustling lightly in the crisp wind. It was the kind of evening where the sun dipped below the horizon too quickly, and the sky, though clear, seemed darker than usual. I had been traveling for work, my job often taking me to different cities where I stayed in hotels that all seemed to blur together after a while. This particular one was an old, towering structure on the outskirts of a small town, a place that had likely seen better days. The facade was grand, but the once pristine paint was now cracked and peeling. Its neon sign flickered intermittently, casting weak red light onto the pavement below. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun had begun its descent. The hotel lobby was quiet, almost eerily, so a single overhead light buzzed faintly, illuminating a long reception desk with an old-fashioned brass bell on the counter. Behind it, a woman with tired eyes and an expressionless face handed me my key without much conversation. "You're in room 306, she said, sliding the key across the desk. Her voice was flat, as if she had spoken those words 1,000 times before. I nodded, taking the key. "Is there a restaurant nearby?" She pointed vaguely down the street. "Couple of places. But if you're staying here, breakfast is served in the dining hall downstairs. 7 to 9. "Thanks." I turned away, pulling my small suitcase behind me as I headed for the elevator. The entire place smelled faintly of old wood and something musty, like books that had been left untouched for too long. The elevator doors groaned as they opened, revealing a dimly lit interior with a tarnished brass handrail running along the sides. I stepped in and pressed the button for the third floor. The ride up was slow, the kind of slow that made you wonder if the cables were struggling to hold the weight. When the doors finally slid open, the hallway stretched out before me, narrow and lined with faded wallpaper. A few doors down, a single light flickered above, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Room 306 was at the end of the hall. As I reached it, I hesitated for a second, feeling an inexplicable discomfort settle in my chest. But I shook it off and slid the key into the lock. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a standard hotel room, nothing particularly strange. A bed with crisp white sheets, a desk with an old lamp, a window covered by thick beige curtains. I sighed, tossing my bag onto the bed and pulling out my phone. No service. I frowned, walking toward the window. Pulling back the curtain, I was met with a view of the parking lot below, mostly empty except for a few scattered cars. Beyond that, the road stretched into the distance, disappearing into the darkening landscape. Shaking off the strange unease that had settled over me, I turned away and began my usual routine. A quick shower, a change into more comfortable clothes, and then I settled into the chair at the desk, flipping open my laptop to catch up on emails. The night stretched on uneventfully. The hum of the air conditioning was the only sound in the room, filling the silence with a low, steady drone. After an hour or so, I decided to call it a night. Climbing into bed, I pulled the blankets up and let out a slow breath. Just another night in just another hotel. Or so I thought. The first sign that something was off came in the middle of the night. I had been in a deep sleep, the kind that makes it hard to tell how much time has passed when you wake up. My eyes blinked open to near total darkness, save for the dim green glow of the digital clock on the nightstand. 2:47 a.m. I wasn't sure what had woken me up. My heart was pounding slightly, my skin cool from the air conditioning. At first, I thought it was just one of those random moments where your body wakes itself up for no reason. I shifted under the blankets, trying to settle back into sleep. Then I heard it. A faint knock. It was soft, deliberate, 3 light taps against the door. I froze. Lying there, I listened, my breathing shallow. Maybe it was just another guest. I waited, staring at the ceiling. A full minute passed, then another. No other sounds, no footsteps, no voices. Convincing myself it had been nothing, I turned onto my side and shut my eyes. Sleep was just beginning to pull me under again when, knock, knock, knock. This time, it was louder. My pulse spiked as I sat up, now fully awake. I turned toward the door, but of course, I couldn't see anything in the dark. My first thought was to check the peephole. Maybe it was a staff member, though I couldn't think of any reason why someone would need to reach me at this hour. Sliding out of bed, I moved cautiously toward the door. The floor was cold beneath my feet as I crept forward, listening. Nothing. Whoever had knocked wasn't saying a word. I reached for the peephole and pressed my eye to it. The hallway outside was empty. A wave of unease crawled up my spine. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it had been from another room. That had to be it. Still, I hesitated before backing away. The room felt different now, not quite right. The silence around me felt heavier, like something was pressing down on the air itself. I climbed back into bed, my body tensed under the blankets. I told myself it was nothing. Just a weird, half-asleep moment where my brain had played tricks on me. But as I lay there, my ears strained for any sound. For a long time, there was nothing but the hum of the air conditioning and my own heartbeat. Then, just as I was starting to relax, something else happened. From the corner of the room, near the desk, came a soft rustling, like fabric shifting, or someone moving. I stopped breathing. My body went rigid as I stared into the darkness. The room was pitch black beyond the faint glow of the clock, and I couldn't see anything. But I could feel it. Something was there. I wanted to turn on the lamp, but a part of me was afraid of what I might see. Instead, I remained frozen, listening, my breath shallow. The sound stopped. Seconds passed, then minutes. The room remained still. Slowly, cautiously, I reached for my phone on the nightstand. I pressed the power button. Nothing. The screen stayed black. Battery dead. Which didn't make sense. I had at least 60% before I went to bed. I set it back down, swallowing against the dry lump in my throat. Then, from the foot of the bed, the blanket shifted. I felt it. A small tug, as if someone had barely brushed against the fabric. I shot up, fumbling for the lamp. The second my fingers found the switch, I flipped it on. The room was empty. Nothing at the foot of the bed. Nothing near the desk. The curtains were still drawn, undisturbed. But my gut told me I hadn't imagined it. For the next hour, I sat there, my back against the headboard, staring at the room in the dim yellow glow of the lamp. My ears remained alert for any other sounds, my eyes scanning every shadow. By the time exhaustion finally won, I didn't turn the light off. I just pulled the blankets up and let myself drift off, knowing something wasn't right. But I still had no idea just how wrong things were about to get. I woke up the next morning to the sound of my alarm. The room was filled with pale morning light filtering through the curtains, but despite the new day, I still felt that lingering unease from the night before. The lamp was still on beside me, casting a dim glow in contrast to the daylight. I sat up slowly, rubbing my face. Had I just been overreacting? Maybe exhaustion had gotten the best of me. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it all, just my brain playing tricks in the dark. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The chair at the desk. It had moved. When I had gone to bed, it had been neatly pushed in, tucked under the desk. Now, it was pulled out just slightly, maybe a foot away from where it had been. I stared at it, my pulse picking up. Did I move it? Maybe when I grabbed my laptop? I replayed my actions from the night before, trying to come up with an explanation. But I knew I hadn't touched that chair after putting my laptop away. Brushing off the feeling creeping up my spine, I got up and went through my usual morning routine. A shower, getting dressed, packing up my laptop. By the time I was ready to leave the room, I had convinced myself it was nothing. The hallway outside was just as eerily quiet as it had been the night before. The carpet muffled my footsteps as I made my way to the elevator, glancing down the corridor toward the far end. There were no other guests, no signs of movement, just the dim flickering light above one of the doors. Downstairs, the lobby was empty except for the front desk attendant. The same woman as before, standing behind the counter, staring blankly at something on the screen in front of her. I hesitated, then walked up. "Hey," I said, leaning against the counter. "Weird question, but does anyone else stay on the third floor?" She didn't look up. After a few seconds of silence, she finally said, "Why?" I shrugged. "I thought I heard someone knocking on my door last night. Just wondering if maybe a guest got the wrong room." Her fingers stopped typing. This time, she did look up. "You heard knocking?" I frowned at her tone. Something about the way she said it, low, flat, almost like she was confirming something, made my skin prickle. "Yeah," I said slowly. "A couple of times, around 2 in the morning. But when I checked the peephole, no one was there." She stared at me for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she looked down, tapped a few keys, and after a few seconds, turned the screen toward me. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but when I saw the guest list for the third floor, my breath caught. There was only one occupied room listed under the third floor. "Mine," I swallowed. "So, no one else was up there?" She shook her head. "Not according to our records." I let out a slow breath, forcing a chuckle. Guess I was just hearing things. She didn't laugh. Instead, she glanced around the lobby, then leaned in slightly. Her voice dropped, just above a whisper. "If you hear anything else, don't open the door." I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. Before I could ask her what she meant, a door behind her swung open, and a man in a maintenance uniform walked out. The woman immediately straightened, her neutral expression snapping back into place. "Enjoy your stay," she said, her voice returning to the same monotone as before. I took the hint. I grabbed a quick breakfast at a small diner down the road, but my mind kept circling back to what she had said. "If you hear anything else, don't open the door." What the hell did that mean? More strange occurrences. The day passed uneventfully. I spent most of it working, walking around town, trying to shake off the lingering tension. By the time I returned to the hotel that evening, I had almost convinced myself I had been overreacting. Almost. The elevator ride up felt slower this time, like it was deliberately dragging out my return to the third floor. When the doors finally opened, I stepped out into the hallway, my stomach tightening as I saw my door waiting at the end. Everything looked the same. The dim hallway, the flickering light, the old wallpaper peeling at the edges. But the air felt heavier. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was just as I had left it, except for one thing. The closet door was open. Not wide open, just cracked. A few inches. I knew for a fact I hadn't touched that closet. Slowly, I stepped toward it, every muscle in my body tensed. I reached out and, with one quick motion, pulled the door all the way open. Nothing. Just an empty closet with a few wooden hangers rattling against the rail. I let out a shaky breath, rubbing my face. This was ridiculous. Maybe housekeeping had come in and left it open. Maybe the door didn't close properly. I shut it firmly, making sure the latch clicked into place. Then I tested it, pulled at the handle. That night, I left the lamp on again. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to come. But something in me was wound too tight. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At some point, exhaustion won. I must have been asleep for a couple of hours when I woke up to something very wrong. The room was freezing, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the air had an almost metallic sharpness to it. I sat up, gripping the blankets. The lamp was still on, casting a faint glow over the room. But something felt different. Then I noticed it. The closet door. It was open again. Not just cracked this time, wide open. The hangers inside were swaying. Something was in the room. I wanted to get up, run to the door, but my body felt heavy, like I was sinking into the mattress. My fingers gripped the sheets so tightly they ached. Then, from the far corner of the room, I heard a sound. A slow, dragging breath. Inhale, hold, exhale. It was right there. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The air was thick, pressing against my chest. I wanted to move, wanted to turn on every light, but I was frozen. Then, the blankets yanked. Not a gentle pull, a hard, deliberate yank. I bolted out of bed, heart hammering, lunging for the nightstand. My hands fumbled with the switch. Click. The lamp went out. The room was pitch black. And then, right next to my ear, a whisper, not words, not even a voice I could fully recognize. Just a sound, long, slow, rasping, a breath that wasn't mine. I don't remember throwing myself toward the door, but the next thing I knew, I was yanking it open, stumbling into the hallway. The flickering light above me buzzed faintly. The hallway was empty, but inside my room, just before the door swung shut behind me, I heard something move. Something shifted, and I wasn't alone in that room anymore. I stood in the dimly lit hallway, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The door to my room was shut now, sealing whatever was inside away. But I knew that I wasn't just hearing things. Something had been in that room with me. I turned, scanning the hallway. It was empty, just as before. The flickering light overhead cast unsettling shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The entire floor was silent. I didn't know where to go. I wasn't about to step back into my room, and I had no interest in standing out here, alone, exposed. I needed to get downstairs. I hurried toward the elevator, pressing the button with more force than necessary. The old metal doors groaned as they slid open, revealing the small, dimly lit interior. Stepping inside, I stabbed at the lobby button and waited. The doors slid shut. The elevator started to descend, the hum of machinery filling the small space. Then, a soft tap. I stiffened. It came from above me. My eyes snapped to the ceiling. There was nothing but the old paneling, the faint glow of the overhead light. Then the tap came again. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, methodical. My stomach clenched. My pulse hammered in my ears. The elevator kept ascending, but the sound didn't stop. And then, just as I reached out to hit the emergency stop, bang! Something slammed against the top of the elevator. I staggered back, pressing myself against the wall, my heart slamming against my ribs. The overhead light flickered, casting the space in and out of darkness. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then, the paneling above me shifted. My breath caught. The thin metal panel in the center of the ceiling began to lift. I could hear it bending, hear the slow creak as something pushed up from the inside. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, a hand slid through the gap. Thin, pale, fingers too long, joints bending the wrong way. It reached, grasping at the air, searching. I lunged forward, slamming my fist against the emergency button. The elevator jerked to a stop. The panel snapped back into place. For a moment, I just stood there, heart hammering, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing. Then, with a shudder, the elevator doors slid open. I bolted. The lobby was dim, just like before, the front desk empty. The same old furniture, the same eerie silence. But something wasn't right. I turned in a slow circle. The air was wrong. Thicker. The space felt off, like I had stepped into something that looked like the lobby, but wasn't. Then I saw her. The woman from the front desk. She stood behind the counter, staring straight ahead. But something was off about her. Her posture was too still. Her skin looked gray in the dim light, her features slightly blurred, like she wasn't fully formed. I swallowed hard, stepping closer. "Excuse me?" She didn't react. Not even a blink. Then, her head twitched. A sharp, unnatural jerk. Her eyes snapped to mine. Wide, hollow, too dark. I took a step back. Her lips parted. And then, in the same monotone voice as before, she spoke. "You shouldn't be here." My mouth went dry. My body screamed at me to run, but I was frozen. She took a step forward, her feet barely making a sound. "You need to go." Her voice was wrong. Like it was layered, like multiple voices were speaking at once. Then, the lights went out. The entire lobby plunged into darkness. And in that moment, I heard it. Not the woman. Something else. A sound that didn't belong. A low, rattling breath. Behind me, the air turned ice cold. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. But I could feel it. Close. Too close. Then, something touched my shoulder. Not a light brush. A firm grip. Cold, unnatural fingers pressing into my skin. I ran. I don't even remember how I made it to the door. 1 second I was frozen. The next I was outside, stumbling into the damp night air. I didn't stop. I sprinted across the parking lot, gasping, my lungs burning. I didn't turn around. I wouldn't. I made it to my car, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. Hands shaking, I jammed the key into the ignition, my breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. The engine roared to life. And that's when I finally looked up. Through the windshield, back toward the hotel. The lobby lights were on again. The woman was standing outside the glass doors, staring at me. Her lips parted. She smiled. A slow, unnatural grin. And then, she lifted one hand and waved. I slammed the car into drive and peeled out of the lot. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. And even now, as I sit here, writing this, I know one thing for certain. Something was in that hotel. And it didn't want me to leave. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that hotel, the glowing vacancy sign shrinking in my rearview mirror until it was swallowed by the darkness. My hands were still gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, my mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. The rational part of me kept searching for an explanation, something that made sense. Maybe it had been sleep deprivation or some elaborate trick played by the hotel staff, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. That place was wrong. The air had felt different. The walls had moved. And that woman, she wasn't human. I forced myself to focus on the road ahead, trying to steady my breathing. I needed to get as far away as possible. No stopping, no looking back. But something wasn't right. The road stretched ahead, endless and dark. The headlights barely cut through the heavy fog rolling across the pavement. The trees on either side seemed closer than before, their branches reaching, twisting. I checked the GPS. No signal. I checked my phone. No service. My stomach twisted. I had been driving for at least an hour, but it felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. The road just kept going, the fog growing thicker with each passing mile. I gritted my teeth, pushing down the rising panic. Maybe I had taken a wrong turn in my rush to get out of there. Maybe I was just imagining things. But then, I saw it. A sign on the side of the road, partially hidden by the fog. I slowed the car, my pulse hammering as my headlights illuminated the weathered wooden post. And my blood ran cold. Welcome to Pine Hollow Inn. Vacancy. I hit the brakes so hard the tires skidded against the asphalt. No, this wasn't possible. I had just left. I had been driving for over an hour. And yet, the hotel was right there. Exactly as I had left it. The neon vacancy sign flickering. The parking lot empty. The woman at the front desk standing behind the glass doors, watching me. I swallowed hard, my entire body going numb. I couldn't be here. I had left. Hadn't I? My hands shook as I put the car in reverse, the engine growling as I backed away. Then, the radio turned on. A burst of static, loud and jarring, filled the car. I jumped, my breath catching in my throat as a low, crackling voice whispered through the speakers. You can't leave. I hit the power button. The radio stayed on. You're already here. The voice wasn't mine. It wasn't coming from any station I recognized. I slammed my foot against the gas pedal. The tires screeched against the pavement as the car lurched forward, away from that cursed place. My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear the sound of the wind rushing past. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. And this time, I didn't see the hotel again. By the time I reached a gas station, I was shaking so badly I could barely get out of the car. The bright fluorescent lights overhead felt too harsh, too real after everything I had just experienced. I stumbled inside, my clothes damp with sweat, my heartbeat still hammering in my ears. The attendant, a tired-looking man with graying hair, glanced up from behind the counter. You all right, man? He asked, giving me a once-over. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. I probably looked insane, pale, wide-eyed, still catching my breath. Where am I? I finally croaked. The man frowned. You're about 2 hours outside of town. Everything okay? 2 hours? I checked my phone again. Still no service. I swallowed hard. That hotel, Pine Hollow Inn. Do you know it? The man's expression shifted. Something dark passed over his face. Something unreadable. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. There ain't no hotel out here, he said. Not anymore. My blood ran cold. What do you mean? He sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Burned down years ago. They said it was an accident, but... He shook his head. Nobody ever rebuilt it. I felt a chill creep up my spine. But I was just there, I stammered. It's still standing. I stayed the night. The man's eyes hardened. You need to leave it alone, he said firmly. Don't go back. Don't even talk about it too much. Some things, he hesitated, lowering his voice. Some things don't like being remembered. A heavy silence hung between us. I didn't press him for more. I just nodded, bought a coffee I wasn't going to drink, and got back in my car. And this time, when I checked my GPS, I had service again. I followed the route home, never once looking in the rearview mirror. I didn't talk about that night for a long time. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't. Every time I tried to put it into words, my mind felt like it was hitting a wall, like the details were slipping through my fingers the moment I reached for them. Even now, sitting here, recalling every moment as clearly as I can, there are pieces that don't fit. Moments that feel wrong. How did I end up back at that hotel? Why did the road never change? What was she? I wish I could say I have answers, that I looked deeper into it, found some old newspaper articles, maybe even went back during the day to prove to myself it was real. But I didn't. I never went back. I still don't know if that place really existed or if it only existed for me. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I'll see something flicker in the distance. A neon vacancy sign, glowing in the dark. And I turn the other way. Because some roads don't lead anywhere. And some doors shouldn't be opened. I spent summers hiking, camping, and exploring with my friends. The smell of damp earth and pine needles, the sound of rustling leaves, and the feeling of cool air against my skin were all familiar and comforting. But Black Hollow was different. It had a reputation. It sat just outside our town, a dense stretch of wilderness that no one really had a reason to go into. The trees were thicker there, the paths overgrown, and the silence unsettling. People said it was cursed, that those who wandered in alone never came out the same. I always dismissed those stories as local superstition. Every town has its legends, and ours just happened to be about Black Hollow. That fall, I was in my last year of college. It was one of those weekends where my friends and I had nothing to do, so we started talking about all the dumb things we used to do as kids. The conversation naturally turned to Black Hollow. Someone mentioned the stories, how people talked about strange lights flickering between the trees, whispers carried by the wind, and the feeling of being watched. We laughed, shrugged it off, and dared each other to go. It was just a joke at first, but the more we talked about it, the more it sounded like a challenge. We decided to camp there for one night. No one had ever done it before, at least no one we knew. It wasn't about proving anything. It was just for fun. We planned everything: tents, flashlights, snacks, and enough firewood to last until morning. There were 4 of us: me, my best friend, and 2 others. We had been friends since high school, and we had done plenty of stupid things together. Sneaking into abandoned houses, exploring train tunnels, even spending the night in an old cemetery once. Black Hollow felt like just another adventure. We set out in the late afternoon, hiking in while there was still daylight. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Too quiet. The deeper we went, the more the usual sounds of the woods faded away. No birds, no insects, no rustling in the underbrush. Just our footsteps crunching against fallen leaves. I told myself it was just my imagination. We walked for nearly an hour before we found a clearing big enough to set up camp. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The air felt heavier here, colder, like the warmth of the day didn't quite reach this place. We made a fire, set up our tents, and sat around talking. The mood was light at first. Jokes, stories, the occasional glance into the darkness beyond our little circle of light. We all felt it, that creeping unease that settled in as night took over. But no one said anything. No one wanted to be the first to admit it. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air. The only sound for miles. At some point, I glanced at my watch. It was past midnight. The fire was burning low, and my friends had started to doze off one by one. I wasn't tired. Something about the silence, the way the trees loomed over us, kept me alert. Then I heard it. A sound. Faint, almost too soft to notice. A rustling in the distance, like footsteps moving through the leaves. I sat up, my heart picking up speed. The fire flickered, casting long shadows that shifted and stretched. I listened, holding my breath. Nothing. Just the wind. Probably an animal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I turned toward my best friend, nudging him awake. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He blinked, groggy. "Hear what?" I listened again. Silence. The kind that felt unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. "Never mind," I muttered. He grunted and rolled over, pulling his sleeping bag tighter around him. I lay back, staring up at the gaps between the trees. The firelight flickered against the branches, casting strange, shifting patterns. Sleep didn't come easily. And then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it again. Closer this time. Something moving just beyond the firelight. I sat up so fast my head spun. The trees stood motionless, the darkness between them stretching endlessly. I reached for my flashlight, but my hands felt cold, clumsy. The beam cut through the blackness, landing on empty ground. Nothing there, but the feeling didn't go away. The sense that something was standing just out of sight, watching, waiting. I swallowed hard and forced myself to lie back down. Maybe I was just spooking myself. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew something was out there. I don't know how long I lay there, staring up at the treetops, but sleep never really came. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something, soft movements in the distance, the faintest sound of leaves shifting. It wasn't the wind. There was no breeze, no rustling in the branches above. It was low, controlled, deliberate, like footsteps. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, just the natural sounds of the forest at night. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, something about it felt wrong. I turned onto my side, glancing at my best friend's tent. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim glow over the campsite. The others were asleep, their breathing slow and steady. I was the only one awake. That's when I heard it again. Closer this time. A soft crunch of leaves, maybe 10, 15 feet beyond the firelight. I froze. My pulse pounded in my ears as I strained to listen. The sound came again, another step, careful, calculated. Not the quick, erratic movements of an animal. It was slow, deliberate. Someone, or something, was out there. I sat up slowly, my breath shallow, my muscles tense. My hand found the flashlight beside me, fingers tightening around it. For a moment, I just sat there, listening. Then, silence. The kind of silence that felt unnatural. I clicked on the flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks, the tangled undergrowth, the empty forest floor. Nothing there. I exhaled, barely realizing I'd been holding my breath. Maybe it had just been an animal after all. Shaking my head, I shut off the flashlight and lay back down, forcing myself to close my eyes. It was nothing, just my imagination getting the better of me. But then, whisper, not words, not even a voice, really. Just a breath, a sound, like someone exhaling just behind me. I shot up so fast my head spun. The flashlight was back in my hands before I even registered reaching for it. The beam cut through the darkness again, sweeping across the trees. I turned, scanning the entire area, my hands trembling. Nothing, but the feeling remained. That undeniable sense of being watched. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. I needed to wake someone up. I needed someone else to hear this, to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. I turned toward my best friend's tent and whispered his name. No response. I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. Frustrated, I reached over and shook his tent. "Hey, wake up," I hissed. A groggy mumble came from inside, followed by the sound of the zipper being yanked down. A second later, his face appeared, bleary-eyed and irritated. "What? Did you hear that?" I whispered. "Hear what?" "That." I hesitated, scanning the trees again. The flashlight beam wavered slightly as my hand shook. "I don't know." Footsteps. A whisper. "Something's out there." He sighed, rubbing his face. "Dude, it's the woods. Probably an animal." "This wasn't an animal," I snapped, my voice lower now. "It sounded like a person." He frowned but didn't look convinced. "You're probably just spooking yourself." "I know what I heard," I insisted. He sighed again, then reached for his own flashlight. "Fine, let's check it out." He stepped out of the tent, stretching, then aimed his beam into the trees. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but more trees, tangled branches, and patches of dead leaves. He scanned left, then right, then back again. "See?" "Nothing," he said. I didn't answer, because at that moment, the sound returned. Another step. This time, both of us heard it. We froze. His flashlight jerked toward the source of the sound. The beam landed on an empty stretch of trees, just beyond the firelight. Nothing moved. No wind, no shifting branches. But something was there. I could feel it. My friend took a slow step forward. "Hello?" he called out. His voice was firm, but cautious. No response. Then, another sound. Not footsteps this time. Something scraping against bark. Long, slow, deliberate. Like fingernails dragging down a tree trunk. A chill crawled up my spine. My friend turned to me, his expression finally matching the unease I felt. "We should go back to the tent," he muttered. I nodded. Neither of us wanted to admit it, but we weren't alone out there. We backed away slowly, keeping our flashlights pointed at the trees. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I forced myself to move carefully. I didn't want to turn my back on whatever was out there. We reached the campfire, its dying embers barely casting any light now. I grabbed more wood, tossing it into the pit, and within seconds, flames flickered back to life. The warmth did little to ease the cold dread in my chest. My other two friends stirred, blinking sleepily. "What's going on?" one of them mumbled. "We heard something," my best friend answered. His voice was too calm, forced. The others sat up, looking between us. "Like what?" "Footsteps," I said. "And something scratching a tree." One of them scoffed. "Probably just an animal." I shook my head. It wasn't. The air around us felt heavier now, like the darkness had thickened. The forest was still unnervingly silent. No wind, no night sounds, nothing. We sat there, huddled closer to the fire, trying to shake off the tension. No one wanted to say it, but none of us were going back to sleep. Not after that. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows. And then, a sound. Not footsteps this time. A low, wet gurgling noise. Not far. Maybe 20 feet from the edge of the clearing. Every hair on my body stood on end. "What the hell was that?" one of my friends whispered. No one answered. We were all listening now, barely breathing. The sound came again. Low, wet, inhuman. Then, the trees shifted. Something moved just beyond the firelight. Not fast, not sudden, just shifting, like something tall, something standing there, watching. My best friend gripped my arm, his fingers digging in. His face was pale, his breathing uneven. "We need to leave," he whispered. No one argued. We scrambled to our feet, grabbing only what we needed. The fire crackled, casting shifting shadows around us. I tried to keep my eyes on the trees, on the darkness beyond the light. But I saw it. Just for a second. A shape. Too tall, too thin, standing perfectly still between the trees. Not moving, not blinking, just watching. And then, it stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. I've never been more certain of one thing in my life. Whatever it wasn't done with us. The air had thickened since the shape vanished into the darkness. The trees, which once seemed like lifeless giants towering over us, now felt like silent witnesses to something we weren't supposed to see, something we weren't meant to understand. That unsettling feeling crept into every corner of the campsite, like the shadows had become more than just darkness. They were alive, aware, watching. The fire burned brightly in front of us, the flames flickering and dancing in desperate attempts to hold back the night. The crackling of the burning wood was the only sound that filled the air, and even that felt hollow. The oppressive silence around us made every little noise, every snap of a twig, every gust of wind feel like it was echoing through an empty void. None of us spoke as we huddled together by the fire, the warmth of the flames doing little to chase away the chill that had settled in our bones. My friends, normally loud and carefree, had become quiet, tense. The easy banter we'd shared earlier in the evening had dissolved into nothing more than nervous glances and heavy silence. I kept replaying the image in my mind, the tall, thin shape standing just beyond the light. It had been there, real and solid, before disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. That moment, that brief encounter, had shaken me to my core. I tried to shake off the anxiety clawing at my chest, but every time I closed my eyes, the image of the figure would flash in my mind. My heart would race, my pulse quicken, as though the thing was still watching, still waiting. The sound came again. A low, rasping noise, like something dragging itself across the forest floor. I tensed, my body going rigid. It came from the same direction as before, just beyond the reach of the firelight, hidden in the dense underbrush. It wasn't just an animal this time. The sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. "Did you hear that?" one of my friends whispered, his voice trembling. I nodded without saying anything. I couldn't speak, couldn't find the words. The air felt thick in my throat, suffocating. The more I listened, the clearer it became that we were not alone. I glanced at my best friend, whose face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He was gripping the flashlight so tightly that his knuckles were white. "We need to find out what that is," he whispered. His words, though soft, carried the weight of something much heavier, something unspoken. He didn't have to say it. We all knew that we couldn't just stay here and wait for whatever it was to come closer. I wasn't sure what had come over us, but at that moment, none of us wanted to stay idle. We had to know what was out there, what was watching us. So, without saying a word, we all stood up together. The firelight illuminated our faces, but the shadows beyond the fire seemed darker, more consuming. My hand was shaking as I reached for the flashlight, and when I clicked it on, the beam sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees, bushes, and a floor blanketed in dead leaves. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow as I scanned the area. The light shook slightly in my hands, betraying my unease. My best friend was the first to move, stepping forward cautiously, his flashlight aimed in front of him. I followed him, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. My breath was coming faster now, faster than it should have been. I was scared, but there was something else, something I couldn't explain. It wasn't just fear. It was an overwhelming compulsion to uncover the truth, to understand what had happened. We moved in silence, each of us staying close to the others, our eyes darting back and forth as if expecting the forest itself to close in around us. Every creak of a branch, every shift in the leaves, sent us into a new wave of tension. A crack sounded to our left. We froze. The noise was sharp, like something heavy had stepped on a branch, but it wasn't followed by the usual rustle of leaves or the scurrying of animals. It was too quiet. We turned slowly, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The beam landed on a patch of trees, their trunks gnarled and twisted, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. Nothing. But there was something else. A strange smell, damp and rancid, like rotting wood, filled the air. It was thick and heavy, clinging to the back of my throat as I tried to breathe. My stomach churned. "Do you smell that?" one of my friends whispered. We all nodded, the stench undeniable. "Something's not right," my best friend murmured. His voice had dropped to a whisper, as though even the forest might hear him. "Maybe it's just the forest," I suggested, though I didn't believe it for a second. The ground beneath our feet seemed different now, too. Each step felt softer than before, like the earth was giving way under us. We moved cautiously, each of us scanning the area, our senses heightened, but still, we found nothing. Then, as we made our way further into the woods, the air grew colder. The temperature seemed to drop without warning, sending a shiver down my spine. I looked up, but the canopy of trees above us blocked out most of the moonlight, leaving us in near complete darkness. The wind, which had been silent for hours, picked up suddenly, howling through the trees, making the branches creak and groan like the sound of a distant, tortured voice. The wind swept through the leaves, carrying a sound that wasn't quite right, a low hum, almost like the sound of a distant, eerie song. But it wasn't a song. It was something far darker, something unsettling. The sound grew louder, closer. I turned to my best friend, my eyes wide with terror. "Do you hear that?" He nodded grimly, the color draining from his face. We need to get back to camp. Now. But before we could move, a new sound reached our ears. A soft, almost imperceptible clicking noise, like nails tapping against glass. It was coming from behind us. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just trees, dark and silent. The clicking stopped. And then, with horrifying clarity, I realized it wasn't the sound of nails. It was the sound of teeth. Sharp, clicking, chattering. I felt my heart seize in my chest. My best friend took a step backward, his flashlight shaking in his hands. We need to go. Now. I didn't argue. None of us did. We turned and began to walk back to the camp, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as we moved. Every creak of the trees, every gust of wind, every snap of a branch felt amplified, like the forest was closing in on us. The shadows were deeper now, darker. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something moving behind us, but there was nothing. Only the thick, oppressive blackness of the woods. But the feeling lingered, the feeling that we weren't alone. That whatever it was, whatever had been out there in the dark, was still following us. We didn't speak as we walked back to the camp. Not one word. The only sound was our hurried footsteps and the occasional crack of a twig beneath our boots. But the air had changed again. It was heavier now, suffocating. The forest had never felt more alive, more aware of our every move. I don't know how long it took us to get back to the clearing, but by the time we reached the fire, the sun was just beginning to rise. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows around the campsite. We collapsed onto the ground, breathing hard, our bodies exhausted, but our minds racing. We didn't talk about what had happened, what we had heard, what we had felt. The sun barely peeked over the horizon before our surroundings started to change once again. The air, which had grown heavy and damp during the night, now felt oppressive in a way that had nothing to do with the humidity. The chill that lingered deep within us, the cold that never quite left our bones, had a weight to it. It was as if the forest had become aware of us, as if the trees themselves were listening, waiting. None of us had spoken a word since the encounter, not out of exhaustion, but because we didn't have to. There was an unspoken understanding. We all knew the forest wasn't done with us. I stood up first, unable to sit still any longer. My legs were stiff from the long night, but it was more than that. There was a sense of dread that had settled over me, and I couldn't shake it. My hands trembled as I reached for my backpack, pulling out a water bottle and taking a long drink, trying to calm the rapid beating of my heart. The others stirred, waking up slowly, blinking as the sunlight filtered through the thick canopy above. Their faces were pale, drawn, as if they had all experienced something that couldn't be explained, something that none of us could quite put into words. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate thump. It wasn't far this time, it was too close. My body froze. My heart skipped a beat. I turned my head toward the sound, but I couldn't see anything beyond the thicket of trees. The wind had picked up again, rustling the leaves in a way that felt unnatural, like something was moving just out of sight. "Did you hear that?" One of my friends whispered, his voice tight with panic. There was no need to ask. We all heard it. We exchanged looks, but none of us said a word. We had no choice. We had to investigate, even though every instinct screamed at us to leave, to run as fast as we could, to get as far away from the forest as possible. But something in my gut told me we had no chance of outrunning whatever it was. With slow, careful movements, we began to pack up our gear. No one spoke. The only sound, the soft rustling of our bags and the crackling of the campfire as it died down to a few embers. We moved in unison, too frightened to separate, too anxious to waste time. The forest around us felt suffocating, as though the trees were closing in, their gnarled branches reaching toward us like fingers. We had barely finished packing when the ground beneath us shifted again. A scream, a shriek that cut through the air, high-pitched and guttural, something between an animal and a human. The sound was raw, desperate, but there was a horrifying quality to it that made my skin crawl. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as the hair on the back of my neck stood up. "Run!" someone shouted, but it was too late. The moment the scream pierced the air, the entire forest seemed to come alive, its silence shattered like glass. I turned, but before I could move, a figure emerged from the trees, tall, its form barely discernible in the shadow of the towering trees. I was rooted to the spot. It wasn't the same figure from last night. This one was different, more solid, more real. And it was walking toward us, slowly, methodically, as if it knew we wouldn't run, as if it knew we had nowhere to go. My best friend grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the figure. I didn't resist. There was no time to resist. The figure didn't seem to notice us at first. Its focus on something ahead of it, something we couldn't see. But as we stumbled backward, the figure's head jerked toward us, its eyes glowing an unnatural shade of red, cold, hollow, and unfeeling. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The air felt thick in my lungs, suffocating. My body was frozen in terror, unwilling to move, unwilling to look away from the thing that had emerged from the forest. Its body was twisted, its limbs too long, too spindly. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, with veins that pulsed like living currents under its surface. Its face was a twisted mockery of humanity, sharp, hollow cheeks and a mouth that stretched too wide, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. It raised a long, gnarled arm toward us, and with a horrific creak, it stepped forward. The noise was deafening, like the snap of 1,000 dry branches. We all backed away slowly, but there was nowhere to go. The forest had become a labyrinth, each tree, each shadow, a prison of its own making. The figure continued to move toward us, its eyes fixed on us, unblinking. Every step it took sent a chill through my body, each movement drawing it closer, its presence more overwhelming. We couldn't fight it. We couldn't escape. My best friend pulled out his flashlight, shining it at the creature, but the light seemed to do nothing. It passed right through the figure as if it wasn't there, the beam fading into the darkness without leaving a trace. Panic set in. We all turned to run, but the creature's movement was too fast. It closed the distance in an instant, its long arms reaching out to grab us. A scream tore from my throat as the creature's icy fingers brushed my shoulder, sending a jolt of cold through my body. I felt my body go numb, like the life was being sucked out of me. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the ground, my vision swimming. But just as quickly as it had reached for me, the creature stopped. It didn't pull back. It didn't move away. Instead, it stood there, its eyes boring into mine. The air around me seemed to still, and for a moment, everything was quiet. Too quiet. The creature didn't need to speak. It didn't have to. I understood. It wasn't here to kill us. Not yet. It was waiting. Waiting for us to break. Waiting for us to lose hope. And in that moment, the fear I felt turned into something else, something far worse. Something much darker. The creature wasn't hunting us. It was toying with us. Its mouth stretched wider, revealing a grin that was almost too wide, too unnatural. A slow, deliberate smile that sent waves of terror through my body. And just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, just when I thought I was going to lose my mind, the creature moved away, stepping backward into the shadows. It was gone. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My heart hammered in my chest, my legs shaking beneath me as I forced myself to stand. I looked around, and it was like the forest had returned to its silent, oppressive self. The wind had died down. The leaves were still. The only sound was the sound of my ragged breath and the thudding of my heart. We didn't speak. There were no words left to say. What had just happened? Was it real? Was any of this real? We didn't know. But one thing was certain. The forest wasn't done with us. It would never let us leave. And that was when we realized we weren't the ones being hunted. We were the prey. We didn't wait for another moment of hesitation. As soon as the creature disappeared into the shadows, panic took over. Fear had us running, our legs moving before we even realized what we were doing. There was no coherent thought, no plan, just a primal urge to get as far away from whatever that thing was. We ran through the woods, the dense undergrowth tearing at our clothes, the uneven ground tripping us up every few steps. The dense trees loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches blocking any hope of seeing the open sky. The air was thick with the scent of moss and damp earth, the smell of decay that hung heavy over everything. It felt like the forest was closing in around us, tightening its grip as we stumbled forward. None of us spoke a word. Our breath ragged, our bodies covered in cold sweat as we pushed ourselves harder, faster. We didn't know where we were going, just anywhere but here. We had no map, no compass, just the growing realization that we had no idea how to escape the nightmare we had walked into. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Time had become irrelevant. It felt like the world around us had turned into something distorted, something unfamiliar. We didn't know if we were heading towards safety or deeper into the heart of the forest, but we couldn't stop. Then, as if to mock our desperate attempt at escape, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, like the crunch of dry leaves underfoot, came from behind us. It was unmistakable, the heavy, dragging thud of something moving. We didn't dare look back. If we did, we knew we would lose any shred of sanity we had left. But we couldn't outrun it. The dread in the pit of my stomach told me that much. We pushed on a few more steps, then another noise, a rustle in the bushes, a deep, guttural growl. The hairs on my neck stood up as I heard the sound grow closer. Whatever it was not human. It was something else, something monstrous, following us, waiting for us to falter, to give in to the terror. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noises stopped. The forest fell silent again, the only sound the labored breathing of our group. We stopped dead in our tracks, the fear settling like a heavy weight on our chests. It was too quiet, too still. We didn't know whether the creature had lost interest in us or if it was preparing for the next move. But I could feel it, the sense that we were being watched, scrutinized by something unseen. "We can't keep running," one of my friends finally said, his voice shaky, barely more than a whisper. "We need to find a way out of here. We need to get to safety." I nodded, my mind racing for any possible solution. "We should head back toward the trail," I suggested, my voice strained with exhaustion. "Maybe we can find the path again." But the trail had long since disappeared. We had been wandering aimlessly for what felt like an eternity, losing any sense of direction. Even the landmarks we had passed before seemed unfamiliar now. The forest had changed. We were trapped, caught in a maze that no one could escape. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the overwhelming sense of helplessness that gnawed at me. But deep down, I knew that even if we found the trail again, it might be too late. The forest had already claimed us. As if on cue, the air grew colder, the damp chill creeping under my skin. I shivered, rubbing my arms, trying to dispel the feeling of dread that clung to me. The smell of decay was stronger now, a rancid odor that made me gag. It was unmistakable, the stench of death. One of my friends crouched low to the ground, his face pale. "It's not just us," he whispered, almost to himself. "We're not alone." I turned to him, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" He pointed toward the trees, his finger trembling. At first, I saw nothing, just the dark, twisting trunks of ancient trees. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw it. There, in the distance, something moved. A shadow, a figure, blending in with the darkness. I couldn't make out its shape, but I could see the faint outline of something large, something unnatural, standing motionless, watching us. I froze. My blood ran cold. The creature from before? Or something else? I couldn't say. We didn't wait to find out. We turned, running again without a word, but the fear was overwhelming now. Every step felt heavier, the weight of the forest pressing down on us. I glanced behind me, but the figure was gone. I couldn't tell if it was still following us, but I didn't dare stop to look. I felt my legs growing weaker, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The path ahead was unclear, twisting, winding, a labyrinth that seemed to stretch on forever. We stumbled over roots and rocks, our bodies aching from the strain of running, but we couldn't afford to slow down. And then, finally, through the trees, I saw it, the clearing. It wasn't much, just a small patch of open ground, but it was enough. It was the first sign of civilization I had seen in hours. I pushed forward, feeling a surge of hope, desperate to get out of this nightmare. But as we neared the clearing, the air seemed to grow heavier once again. It was a subtle shift, something I couldn't quite explain, but I felt it, the tension thickening around us, the sense that something was wrong. We broke into the clearing, but as soon as we did, the sounds of the forest stopped. The birds, the rustling of leaves, they all went silent. Even the wind stopped, leaving an eerie, unnatural stillness in its wake. My breath caught in my throat. "What's happening?" I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. And that's when it happened. The ground beneath our feet shifted. The earth trembled, a low rumble that started beneath us and shook the trees. We stumbled, trying to keep our footing, but the ground buckled under our weight. The air grew even colder. The trees around us began to bend, their branches twisting in unnatural ways. I looked up and saw something dark gathering in the sky above, an ominous black cloud that blocked out the sunlight. It wasn't a storm, it was something else, something far worse. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely audible. But it was too late. Before we could move, the earth split open. A dark, gaping hole appeared before us, its edges jagged and unnatural, pulling at the air around it like it was drawing everything in. We froze, too shocked to move, too terrified to do anything but stare at the growing abyss. From the depths of the hole, a voice spoke. It wasn't human. It was low, guttural, a whisper that seemed to reverberate through the air, echoing in our minds, twisting our thoughts. "Leave," it said, "or be consumed." We couldn't answer. We couldn't even move. The voice seemed to seep into our bones, freezing us in place. We couldn't escape. We were trapped. And that was when I knew we would never leave. Not truly. The world around us seemed to blur, each second stretching longer than the last, until the terrifying reality of our situation sank in deeper. The growing darkness that loomed in the sky above us, the twisted shapes of the trees, the unnatural pull of the earth beneath our feet, it all became one. A suffocating weight pressing down, forcing us into submission. I couldn't look away from the gaping hole. Its edges seemed to shimmer with an unsettling light, a faint, ghostly glow emanating from within. The voice echoed in my mind, demanding that we leave or else face the consequences. But no one moved. We were paralyzed by fear, our bodies frozen in place, our minds unable to grasp the full extent of what was happening. I don't know how much time passed. It could have been seconds or hours, the moments between each breath blending into a surreal haze. The air grew heavier, the coldness biting at my skin like an invisible force. The hole in the earth seemed to expand, growing wider with every passing second, pulling everything around it into its abyss. The ground trembled beneath us, a deep, resonant vibration that shook our very souls. We could feel the pull of something ancient, something beyond comprehension, like the forest itself was alive, an entity that had been waiting, watching for this moment to unfold. And yet, there we stood, trapped, helpless. For the first time since we had entered the forest, a sense of hopelessness washed over me. The realization hit hard and fast. This was no longer just about escape. It was about survival. It was about accepting the fact that we had stumbled upon something far older, far darker than we could ever understand. and we were at its mercy. "Please, let us go," one of my friends whispered, his voice trembling. There was no anger in his tone, just a raw, vulnerable plea. But the voice from the abyss didn't respond. It didn't need to. I felt the pull of the ground beneath me, the tug of something dark reaching up from the depths, and I couldn't fight it. My legs gave out, and I fell to my knees, the cold earth beneath me growing colder still. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my heart hammered in my chest as I tried to comprehend what was happening. We were too far gone. There was no escaping this place. There was no way out. The forest around us had become something else, something unrecognizable, a place of shadows and nightmares. The trees seemed to warp and twist as if they were alive, reaching toward us, their gnarled branches curling like fingers, eager to drag us into the earth. I could hear the rustling of leaves again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of something else, something ancient and hungry, moving through the underbrush. The creatures of the forest, if they could even be called creatures, were closing in. I thought of the stories we had heard, the warnings we had ignored, the subtle hints of danger that had been present from the beginning. The old tales about the haunted woods, the place that swallowed people whole, the forest that never let anyone leave. At the time, they had seemed like nothing more than superstition, urban legends designed to scare off those brave enough to venture too far. But now, as I knelt on the cold earth, surrounded by the twisted shadows of the trees, I understood. It was all true. Every word, every warning, every whispered fear. The forest was alive, and it was hungry. I could hear my friends' voices, soft cries, desperate calls, the sound of them scrambling to find a way out, but it was all a blur. My mind was no longer working in any rational way. All I could think about was the cold. The crushing, suffocating cold that was seeping into my bones, freezing my very soul. It wasn't just the air. It was something deeper, something far darker, a presence that hung over us like a shroud. It was as if the forest itself had begun to consume us, piece by piece. And then, just as the last of my strength began to fade, I felt something, or rather, someone, reach out for me, a hand, cold as ice, but gentle in its grip, pulling me from the ground. My body protested, my legs unwilling to move, but the hand was insistent. I looked up, my vision blurred, and saw one of my friends, someone I hadn't realized had moved so close to me, standing over me, his eyes wide with fear. "We have to go," he gasped. His voice was strained, barely audible over the terrifying silence that had descended on the forest. "Come on, we can't stay here." But even as he spoke, I knew there was no going back. There was no escaping the forest. The ancient power that held us in its grip was too strong. We were already part of it, already lost within the depths of its dark embrace. I stood, or at least tried to, my body uncooperative, as if the forest itself had claimed me too. We stumbled forward, moving in whatever direction we thought might lead us to safety, but it was futile. Every step felt like we were walking deeper into the heart of the nightmare. The trees seemed to bend inward, blocking our path, guiding us toward the hole that had opened up in the earth. And then, just as the darkness seemed to swallow us whole, there was a light, a flash, brief and blinding, cutting through the suffocating blackness. It was enough to make us freeze, our minds scrambling to make sense of it. The light flickered again, growing stronger, and for a brief moment, I thought we had been saved. I thought we were free. But the light was not our salvation. It was an illusion, a fleeting moment of hope before the forest claimed us for good. I turned to my friends, my heart pounding, but they were already gone. The abyss had taken them. They had been swallowed up by the darkness, lost in the very earth that had risen up to consume us all. In the end, it wasn't the forest that had won. It was the truth. The truth that we were never meant to leave. This place, this haunted, twisted realm, had always been our home, whether we realized it or not. And now, like all the others before us, we would remain here, trapped within the woods for eternity, with nothing left, but the haunting memories of the life we once knew. And so, the forest waits. It watches. It listens, waiting for the next unsuspecting souls to stumble into its grasp, ready to claim them, as it always has, as it always will. I never thought I'd find myself in a place like that lighthouse. It wasn't supposed to be a long stay, just a temporary job to get me through the winter. I had been working odd maintenance jobs for a few years, hopping from one town to another, fixing old cabins, painting fences, repairing boats. The lighthouse was just another paycheck, or at least that's what I told myself. The place was old, standing alone on a jagged cliff overlooking the sea. The town nearby, if you could even call it that, had maybe 50 people scattered in a few houses along the coast. It wasn't a tourist destination, and no one seemed to visit unless they had a reason to be there. My reason? The lighthouse keeper had gone missing a few months back, and the local authorities had given up searching. They needed someone to maintain the place until they figured out what to do with it. The pay was better than most jobs had taken, and besides, I figured I could use the quiet. I arrived in late October, just before the cold started settling in for good. The wind had a way of cutting through you, even through thick layers, and the air always carried the scent of salt and damp earth. The lighthouse itself was exactly what you'd expect, tall, weathered, and painted in fading white and red. The windows were thick with grime, and the whole place had this feeling like it had been waiting for someone to step inside again. The inside was simple. A small living space on the ground floor, a kitchen with outdated appliances, and a single bedroom that smelled of dust and old wood. The spiral staircase led up to the lantern room, where the massive light had been guiding ships for decades. My job was easy enough: keep the place clean, make sure the generator ran, and check the light every night. Nothing complicated. I kept a routine. Wake up early, check the weather reports, make breakfast, and then go about the maintenance tasks. The isolation didn't bother me at first. If anything, it was peaceful. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks, the occasional seagull crying overhead, and the steady rhythm of my own footsteps as I moved through the lighthouse. There wasn't much to do outside of work, so I took up reading. The previous keeper had left behind a small collection of books, mostly old maritime logs and a few novels. Some of the logs were handwritten, filled with daily notes about the tides, the ships that passed by, and weather patterns. But there were other entries, ones that didn't seem relevant to the job at all. It happened again last night. The sound from the stairs. I checked, but there was nothing there. The light flickered for a second. No storms, no power failure. Just a moment of darkness. I think I saw someone on the rocks today. When I looked again, they were gone. I told myself it was just the ramblings of someone who had spent too much time alone. After all, isolation could do strange things to a person. But there was something about those notes, something in the way they were written, hurried, almost frantic. As if the writer had been trying to convince himself he wasn't losing his mind. At night, the wind howled against the walls, making the entire lighthouse groan. I slept with my door locked, Not because I thought I needed to, but because it just felt safer that way. The first few nights passed without incident. The light turned on when it was supposed to, the generator hummed steadily, and I told myself it'd get used to the eerie silence. But then, small things started to feel off. Nothing major, nothing that couldn't be explained. Just little details that made me pause. The feeling that it left something in one spot, only to find it somewhere else. The faint scent of seawater inside, even when the doors and windows were closed. And the footsteps. They started quietly at first. Just a single creak from the wooden stairs when I was lying in bed. The kind of sound that could be written off as the building settling. But then it happened again. And again. Always at night. Always when I was about to fall asleep. One night, I convinced myself I was imagining it. I got up, checked every inch of the place, and went back to bed. As soon as I closed my eyes, there it was again, one slow, deliberate step on the staircase. I didn't move. I held my breath, straining to hear past the pounding of my own heartbeat. The next step came, just as slow. Closer. I wasn't alone. Lying there in the dark, I kept my breathing slow and shallow, listening. The sound of footsteps on the stairs wasn't something I could explain away anymore. The lighthouse wasn't big, and I knew every creak of the floorboards by now. There was no reason for anything to be moving inside, unless someone, or something, was there with me. For what felt like hours, I stayed perfectly still. The room was cold, but sweat clung to my skin. My hands curled into fists beneath the blankets. The steps had stopped, but the air in the room felt heavy, like something was pressing down on my chest. Every muscle in my body was locked in place, waiting for the next sound, the next sign that I wasn't just imagining it. Nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear. I told myself it had to be the wind, or maybe the old wood shifting with the temperature. It was a lighthouse, after all, built to withstand storms and years of harsh weather. It wasn't unreasonable to think the place made noises on its own. But even as I forced my eyes shut, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I did what any rational person would do. I searched every inch of the lighthouse, top to bottom. I checked the doors, the windows, even the crawl space beneath the floorboards. Nothing. No sign of forced entry, no tracks, no loose panels, just a whole lot of dust and salty air. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I had spent too much time alone reading those damn logs. The last keeper had probably been just as paranoid, hearing things in the dead of night and convincing himself something was there. It was isolation playing tricks, that was all. Still, I made sure to keep a heavy wrench by my bedside that night, just in case. The next few days were uneventful, and I was grateful for the normalcy. The weather had turned rough, with heavy winds rolling in off the ocean. The lighthouse swayed slightly in the stronger gusts, and rain lashed against the windows. It made the nights even louder, with constant rattling and howling through the cracks. It was easy to pretend the noise on the stairs had just been part of the storm. But then, something else happened. Something I couldn't ignore. It was just past midnight, and I had been in the lantern room doing my usual check. The storm had died down, but the sky was still covered in thick clouds, blocking out the moonlight. The sea stretched into endless darkness, no boats in sight, no distant lights on the horizon. Just me and the quiet hum of the beacons spinning above. I was halfway down the stairs when I heard it. A knock. It wasn't a loud, aggressive banging. Just 3 slow, deliberate taps. Knock, knock, knock. I stopped dead in my tracks. My first thought was that someone had made their way up here. Maybe one of the locals. Maybe a lost fisherman looking for shelter. But I knew that wasn't possible. The lighthouse door had been locked, and the knock hadn't come from the entrance downstairs. It had come from inside, from the bedroom door. A chill ran through me, the kind that starts at the base of your spine and spreads until it settles deep in your chest. My grip tightened on the railing. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but nothing made sense. I took slow steps down the staircase, straining to listen past the sound of my own breathing. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, the way I had left it. No movement, no shadow waiting in the dim light. I stepped closer. The floor beneath me groaned, and the silence felt suffocating. I reached out, pushed the door open with the tip of my fingers. Nothing. The room was exactly as I had left it. The blankets were still rumpled from where I had been sitting earlier, the small pile of books untouched. The air smelled the same, old wood and a faint trace of salt. There was no sign that anything or anyone had been there. But I knew what I heard. I wasn't the kind of person to get spooked easily. I had spent nights in abandoned buildings, in empty cabins deep in the woods. I had heard strange noises before. But this was different. I closed the door, locked it. Then, without really thinking, I shoved the small wooden chair under the doorknob. It was probably unnecessary, probably ridiculous. But something about that knock had made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't ignore. I barely slept that night. Every sound made my heart hammer in my chest. The wind outside, the distant crash of waves, the occasional creak of the old wood. Each one set my nerves on edge, waiting for something else. But nothing came. The next morning, I checked the logs again. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe some reassurance that the previous keeper had gone through the same thing. Some kind of explanation. There was an entry from 3 months before, the handwriting messier than usual. The knocking again. I locked the door, but I heard it anyway. It's always 3 knocks. Never more, never less. I don't open it anymore. I stared at the words for a long time. My throat felt dry. I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to tell myself it was all coincidence, that the wind had made it sound like knocking, that maybe I was just exhausted and hearing things. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't the kind of place where things happen by coincidence. And I had a feeling this wasn't over. I didn't want to admit it, but I had started feeling like I was walking through someone else's nightmare. The logs stretched back for years, most of them filled with nothing but weather patterns, ship schedules, and routine maintenance notes. But the later entries, whoever had written them, had been unraveling. There were small things at first. Notes about odd sounds at night, the feeling of being watched. Then, more desperate scribbles. Mentions of things moving on their own. Cold spots that lingered even in the peak of summer. And always, the knocks. Reading through them, I could almost feel the fear pressed into the ink. The last few entries were erratic, words scrawled in a frantic, uneven hand. It's worse when I acknowledge it. Ignoring it used to help. It doesn't anymore. I locked the door. The knocking didn't stop. I saw it last night. I shut the logbook. My pulse thumped against my ribs. I hadn't seen anything, at least, not yet. But the knocking was real, and I had the sinking feeling that ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. That night, the storm came back with a vengeance. Wind battered the lighthouse, rain hammering against the windows and sheets. The beacon's steady rotation cast long shadows through the stairwell, throwing shifting patterns of light across the walls. I sat at the small wooden desk in the bedroom, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The wrench sat beside me, within easy reach. I wasn't going to sleep, not after the last few nights. And then, just past midnight, knock, knock, knock. I stiffened, gripping the edge of the desk. My heart slammed into my throat. The noise had come from the door again, slow and deliberate. 3 knocks. Never more, never less. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe evenly. I turned my head slowly toward the door. The room felt colder than before. The air had that strange, dense quality to it, like the atmosphere shifted just before a storm. I waited. The silence stretched, thick and unnatural. Then, knock, knock, knock. My breath came shallow. The knocking hadn't stopped, just because I ignored it. It had waited. I wanted to tell myself it was the wind, some weird trick of the lighthouse settling in the storm, but my gut told me otherwise. I reached for the wrench, gripping the handle so tightly my knuckles turned white. And then, just beyond the doorknob turned. My chest tightened. The chair I had shoved under the knob held firm, but the movement was unmistakable. Something was on the other side. I shot to my feet, backing away until I hit the far wall. The metal of the wrench felt ice cold in my grip. The knob twisted again. A slow, testing motion. And then, something new. A sound. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't even a breath. It was a scrape. Something dragged against the wood, slow and deliberate, as if tracing the grain of the door with careful precision. My whole body went rigid. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. Then, silence. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. Eventually, my legs started to shake. My pulse hammered in my ears, and my lungs ached from holding my breath. I forced myself to move. Step by step, I approached the door. The wrench trembled in my grip. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. Nothing. I stood there for minutes, maybe longer. When I was finally sure the hallway was empty, I exhaled a shaky breath and reached for the door. My fingers barely grazed the knob before I stopped. There was a mark. Thin, jagged scratches had been carved into the wood, stretching from the handle down to the base. They were uneven, shallow, but fresh. Something had been there. Something had tried to get in. I didn't sleep. By the time the sun rose, my body ached with exhaustion. I had spent the rest of the night sitting against the far wall, wrench still in my grip, waiting for something else to happen. But it didn't. When morning came, I forced myself to move. My limbs felt heavy as I checked every inch of the lighthouse again. The door to the lantern room was still locked. The stairwell was empty. The main entrance remained bolted shut. There was no sign of forced entry. Just those scratches on my bedroom door. I traced them with my fingertips, the wood rough beneath my touch. They weren't random. They weren't the kind of marks an animal would leave. They looked deliberate. I didn't know what to do. If I called for help, what would I even say? That something was knocking on my door at night? That I felt like I was being watched? That I had found scratches in the wood and convinced myself they weren't normal? No one would believe me. Hell, I wasn't sure I even believed me. But I wasn't going to sit around and wait for it to happen again. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the basement. The air down there was stale, thick with the scent of dust and damp wood. My boots scuffed against the stone floor as I made my way through the cramped space, past the old storage crates and rusting tools. Something about the basement had always unsettled me. Maybe it was the way sound seemed to disappear down here, swallowed up by the thick walls. Or maybe it was the fact that I knew, deep down, that I wasn't the first person to feel this way. I searched every corner, shining my flashlight into the dark recesses. I ran my hand along the walls, checking for cracks or openings. Anything that might explain what was happening. And then, in the farthest corner, I saw it. A door. It was small, barely taller than my waist, built into the stone itself. The wood looked older than the rest of the lighthouse, warped from years of moisture. There was no handle, just a heavy iron latch, rusted with time. I crouched down, hesitating. My fingers hovered over the latch, but I didn't touch it. Something felt wrong. The air was colder here. Not just damp, but freezing, like stepping into a room where all the warmth had been sucked away. My breath came out in a faint mist. I pulled back. Whatever was behind that door, I didn't think I wanted to know. I straightened up and stepped away, heart hammering. That was when I heard it, a sound so faint I almost thought I imagined it. A knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps. It was coming from the other side of that door. I stood frozen in the basement, every muscle in my body locking into place. The knock had been soft, barely louder than the sound of my own breathing, but it was there. Real. 3 knocks. Never more, never less. My flashlight shook in my grip as I aimed it at the small, ancient door. The wood was warped and uneven. The iron latch rusted with age. I hadn't even known it was there until moments ago, hidden away in the farthest corner of the lighthouse foundation. My brain screamed at me to turn around, to leave, to pretend I never found it. But I couldn't move, because then, just as before, knock, knock, knock. A sharp, strangled breath caught in my throat. The sound wasn't distant. It wasn't muffled by thick walls or distorted by wind. It was right there, directly behind the door. Something was on the other side. The rational part of my mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe water had warped the wood so much that it was shifting under its own weight. Maybe. But then the latch moved. A slow, scraping sound of metal grinding against metal. The iron bolt, corroded and stiff from decades of neglect, shifted. I stumbled backward, my spine hitting the basement wall with a dull thud. My breath came out in ragged bursts, the air in the room feeling impossibly cold. I had the overwhelming sense that if that latch came undone, if the door creaked open even an inch, I would not be standing here anymore. My shaking fingers found the wrench at my belt. I gripped it so tightly it bit into my palm. I had no plan, no real defense, just raw, frantic terror pumping through my veins. The latch groaned again, moving a fraction more. And then I heard the voice. At first, it was barely audible, just a whisper of sound beyond the thick wood. But as it continued, my blood ran ice cold. It was saying my name, not in a scream, not in a moan, just a quiet, deliberate voice. A voice that sounded just like mine. I choked on a breath, my vision swimming. Every hair on my body stood on end, the weight of something unseen pressing into the air around me. The voice repeated my name again. Soft, closer. I don't remember making the decision to move. I don't remember how I found the strength. But suddenly, I was running. I tore up the basement stairs, my pulse hammering against my skull. My boots thudded against the wood, the sound deafening in the narrow stairwell. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I burst into the main hall, nearly tripping over my own feet as I slammed the basement door shut behind me. My fingers fumbled with the lock, twisting the bolt with a metallic clunk. Silence! I stood there, chest rising and falling in erratic gasps, waiting for something, anything, to follow. But the door remained shut. The house remained still. For the first time since it arrived at the lighthouse, the knocking didn't come again. But I didn't feel relief, because I knew, without a doubt, that it wasn't over. I spent the next few hours pacing the lighthouse, checking every door, every window. My body was running on pure adrenaline, my exhaustion forgotten in the wake of raw fear. I kept expecting to hear it again, that knock, that voice. But the only sounds were the distant crash of waves against the shore and the slow creak of the old building settling. And then, just as the sun began to sink below the horizon, I made my mistake. I looked outside. I had avoided the windows all day, unwilling to risk seeing something I wasn't prepared for. But as I stood near the stairwell leading up to the lantern room, some terrible instinct, compelled me to turn toward the glass. And that's when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the rocks, just beyond the reach of the dying sunlight. Tall, still, watching. I couldn't make out its face. The shadows clung to it unnaturally, distorting its shape in a way that made my stomach twist. But I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, I knew it was looking directly at me. Then it took a step forward. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a chair. My heart pounded so loudly it roared in my ears. My breath came fast and shallow, A tight, wheezing sound. The figure moved again. Not walking, not gliding, just shifting forward, closing the distance between us in a way that defied logic. My hands scrambled for the nearest object, a rusted lantern sitting on the desk, and I gripped it like a lifeline. My pulse drummed against my temples as I forced myself to move, sprinting up the spiral staircase toward the lantern room. The heavy iron door at the top was already open. My hands trembled as I shoved it close behind me, twisting the lock into place. I pressed my back against the cold metal, my breaths ragged and uneven. Outside, the last sliver of sunlight faded beneath the horizon, leaving nothing but darkness stretching beyond the cliffs. And then, knock, knock, knock. I squeezed my eyes shut. My body shook violently, the cold air pressing in from all sides. The knocking wasn't at the basement door. It wasn't at my bedroom door. It wasn't even at the front door. It was here, at the lantern room door. I clamped a hand over my mouth, biting down hard on my lip to stop the whimper rising in my throat. My other hand gripped the lantern tighter, the metal cool and solid against my skin. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then the door handle turned. Slow, methodical, testing. The lock held. For now. My mind raced. There was nowhere left to run. No more doors to barricade. The only thing behind me was the open glass of the lighthouse beacon, and beyond that, the endless black sea. I turned my head slowly, dreading what I might see. The reflection in the glass showed nothing behind me. Nothing at all. But when I looked down at the metal floor, there was a shadow. It stretched beneath the door, spilling across the lantern room floor, its shape shifting and writhing like a thing alive. Not the shadow of a man. Not the shadow of anything human. And then the voice came again. Soft, gentle, saying my name. Right on the other side of the door. I screamed. And in that instant, every single light in the lighthouse went out. The moment the lights went out, the entire world seemed to stop. The blackness swallowed everything. The lantern room, the walls, the sky beyond the glass, it all vanished into a void so absolute that for a moment I thought I had gone blind. Then came the knocking. Louder this time. Faster. Knock, 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 knock. The sound hammered against the iron door, the vibrations rattling through my bones. My breath came in shallow gasps, my chest constricting as panic surged through me. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. Not through the door, not toward whatever was outside. Instead, I turned to the beacon's massive glass panes, to the small ledge just beyond. The wind howled through the open space, the drop below dizzying. The jagged rocks waited at the bottom like broken teeth, the ocean crashing against them in an endless rhythm. But I wasn't thinking about that. I wasn't thinking at all. I swung one leg over the railing, gripping the cold metal with both hands. My fingers ached from the force of my grip, but I didn't loosen them. Behind me, the knocking stopped. Silence! Then, the door burst open. A rush of icy air hit my back, the temperature plummeting in an instant. I didn't turn around. I couldn't, but I felt it. The presence. It loomed behind me, its shape massive, swallowing up the space with something that wasn't human. The weight of its existence pressed against my skull, my vision swimming in its suffocating force. Then, that voice. My voice. So close, almost inside my head. Come back inside. A shudder tore through my body, my grip tightening on the railing. My stomach twisted violently, my instincts screaming at me to let go, to drop, to fall, to escape the thing waiting behind me. But then, light! Blinding, searing light. The beacon flickered on. Not the dim, flickering glow of an old lighthouse struggling against time. No, this was brilliant. Pure, searing white light erupted from the glass, cutting through the darkness like a knife. The pressure behind me vanished. Gone. The weight, the cold, the voice, it all disappeared. I gasped, my body trembling as I slowly turned my head. Nothing was there. The iron door hung open, swinging gently in the wind. The air was still again, the suffocating presence gone. I was alone. I don't remember climbing back inside. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling down the lighthouse steps, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. The beam of the lighthouse cut through the night, stretching far into the sea, as if chasing away something unseen. When I finally reached the bottom floor, I locked every door behind me. The basement door, the front door, every window. Then I sat with my back against the cold wooden floor, the lantern beside me casting flickering shadows against the walls. The house remained silent. No knocks, no whispers, no shadows stretching beneath the doors. Only the sound of the waves and the faint hum of the working light above. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the next either. But nothing else happened. No knocks, no voice, just silence. I left the lighthouse the next morning. I didn't bother packing. I didn't care about the job, about finishing my time there. Whatever was in that lighthouse, whatever I had let out of that basement door, I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I walked straight down the cliffside path to my truck, my heartbeat still unsteady as I threw myself into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and for the first time in days, I felt something close to relief. As I pulled onto the narrow road leading away from the lighthouse, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. And that's when I saw it. The light. It had gone out again. I never went back. The drive away from the lighthouse was the longest of my life. Every bump in the road, every flicker of shadow beyond the trees, every shift of the wind against my truck sent a jolt through my system. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing in the middle of the road behind me. Something that had followed. But there was nothing. Just the road stretching into the early morning haze, the lighthouse fading from sight as I turned onto the highway. By the time I reached the nearest town, I pulled into a gas station, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. My hands were shaking. My face was pale in the reflection of the rearview mirror, my eyes sunken with exhaustion. I sat there for a long time, the engine still running, the world moving around me like I wasn't really there. Then, finally, I pulled out my phone. I called the number I had been given when I took the job. The phone rang, and rang, and rang. No answer. I tried again. Still nothing. My stomach tightened as I scrolled through my emails, searching for any kind of confirmation, any record of who had hired me. But something was wrong. The emails, they were gone. Every single message regarding the job, every contract, every instruction, every response I had received, like they had never existed. A cold, creeping realization settled over me. I wasn't supposed to leave that lighthouse. I wasn't supposed to get away. And now that I had, it was like I had never been there at all. For a long time, I tried to forget, tried to move on. But how do you forget something like that? I moved to a different city, found a different job, built a new routine. And for a while, I convinced myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I had been sleep deprived, stressed. Maybe I had just imagined it. Maybe the lighthouse really was just a lighthouse. And yet, there were nights when I woke up thinking I heard knocking. Nights when I swore I felt something watching from the darkness of my bedroom. Nights when my reflection in the bathroom mirror didn't look quite right. Like something was off. Like something had followed me after all. Months passed. Then, one evening, I found myself sitting at my desk, unable to sleep, my laptop open in front of me. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I hesitated. And then, finally, I typed it in. The name of the lighthouse. The search results loaded, a handful of articles appearing at the top of the page. I clicked the first one. A small news report from over 50 years ago. My stomach twisted as I read. Local lighthouse keeper reported missing after failing to check in with town authorities. Search efforts were conducted, but no trace of him was ever found. The lighthouse was later decommissioned after repeated complaints from new keepers about strange occurrences and electrical failures. Ownership of the property has since remained unclear. I scrolled further. Another report. Another disappearance. Then another. Keepers. Workers. People who had taken the job before me. None of them had ever left. Except me. I slammed the laptop shut, my pulse hammering in my ears. My body felt ice cold. I had escaped, but I wasn't supposed to. I haven't searched for the lighthouse since. Haven't gone near the coast. Haven't taken another job that would put me anywhere near something like that again. But sometimes, I still dream about it. About the light flickering out. About the voice calling me back inside. And in those dreams, when I turn around, there's something standing in the doorway.